I wore my bruises the way I wore my smile, hidden, practiced, permanent. Neighbors called me the luckiest wife on the block, a devoted husband, a high-rise condo, a life that photographed perfectly. No one asked why I wore long sleeves in July. My husband had spent years building a reputation on borrowed money and a stolen title of director, one bad month from losing it all. He didn't know who really signed his paycheck. 15 minutes would prove it. Bryce Caldwell, my husband, 41, logistics operations manager, with the kind of tailored confidence that made neighbors assume we had more money than we did left for work that morning, reminding me to wear something nice because we had an image to maintain. The cardigan qualified. It covered everything that mattered. What he didn't know, what he'd never known in the 5 years he'd worked at Meridian Logistics, was that my father controlled the majority stake in his company. Vernon Thornton, 64, retired private equity investor with silver temples, and the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades making decisions that moved millions, had never mentioned it. I'd asked him not to interfere in my career when I was 24 and newly certified as a financial analyst. He'd honored that, even when honoring it meant watching me marry a man who worked for a company Vernon owned. He'd stayed silent. The irony wasn't lost on me. Bryce strutted into board meetings, dropping strategic insights he thought made him indispensable, and nobody told him the controlling shareholder was his father-in-law. The same father-in-law I hadn't spoken to in 3 months because Bryce didn't like me running to Daddy about our problems. I adjusted the cardigan again. The air conditioning fought against the July heat, losing. Outside, Baltimore shimmered in the kind of humidity that made asphalt soft. How long can a person wear a smile like it's stitched on? How many layers of fabric does it take to hide the truth? I'd been calculating that equation for 2 years since the first time Bryce's frustration about a missed promotion turned into something that left marks. The neighbors saw a successful couple. My mother saw a daughter who'd chosen independence over family dinners. Bryce saw a wife who understood that questioning his authority came with consequences. Nobody saw the bruises. The intercom buzzed. I flinched reflex, not reason, and pressed the button. Yes? Ms. Thornton, your father is here to see you. My stomach dropped. Vernon didn't do unannounced visits. He managed his family investment fund with the same calendar discipline he'd taught me to apply to quarterly reports. Scheduled, documented, never spontaneous. Send him up, I said, and my voice came out steadier than my hands. 90 seconds to check the mirror. The cardigan covered the wrist. The makeup covered the tension. The smile covered everything else. When I opened the door, Vernon stood in the hallway in summer weight wool and Italian shoes, looking like he'd stepped out of a board meeting, which he probably had. His gray eyes, my eyes, the same cool analyst's assessment swept the apartment entry before landing on me. I was in the city, he said. Thought I'd stop by. Lies. Vernon Thornton didn't stop by. He scheduled. He planned. He moved through the world with the precision of a man who'd turned 12 million into 60 million through disciplined timing. Dad, I said, stepping back to let him in. I wasn't expecting you. Bryce is at the office. I know. He walked past me into the living room, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne cedar and something expensive I'd never been able to identify. He didn't sit, didn't make small talk about the weather, or ask about my mother's book club. Instead, he turned to face me with the same expression he probably wore when reviewing financial statements that didn't add up. He reads people the way he reads balance sheets, scanning for what doesn't add up, catching the discrepancies between projected value and actual performance. I'd watched him do it my entire life, seen him sit across from CEOs who thought they could hide leverage ratios behind confident presentations. He always found the truth in the numbers. Now he was looking at me like I was a quarterly report with footnotes that required explanation. I tugged the sleeve down. Reflex. His gaze tracked the movement, stopped on my wrist, traveled up to the cardigan that made no sense in this heat, returned to my face. Lyora, he said, and his voice carried the same quiet authority that had closed billion-dollar deals, the tone that meant he already knew the answer, but was giving me the courtesy of honesty. "Who did that to you?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" No preamble, no social niceties, no pretending he hadn't already calculated the variables and arrived at a conclusion. Just the direct question that cut through every layer of fabric and pretense I'd wrapped around the truth. For the first time in 2 years, someone was looking at me and actually seeing. Not the perfect wife maintaining an image. Not the daughter who'd chosen independence and privacy. Not the woman in the expensive apartment with the successful husband. Just me. And the bruises I couldn't hide from an investor who'd built his fortune on identifying exactly where the numbers betrayed the story. The air conditioning hummed. Outside, someone's car alarm chirped. Vernon stood 3 feet away, waiting, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever I said next would change everything. I opened my mouth, and after 6 years of long sleeves and careful smiles and calculated survival, the truth was about to come out. Standing in my living room, facing Vernon's question, my mind reached back to another locked door, the beginning of trusting the wrong things. I was 23, visiting the Annapolis family home for Sunday dinner. Vernon's home office door stood closed at the end of the upstairs hallway, the way it always did. Mahogany. Solid. Locked. I'd passed that door 1,000 times growing up. Never knocked. Never questioned what he kept inside beyond vague mentions of investment portfolios and diversified holdings. When I asked once what companies he actually owned, he'd looked up from the Wall Street Journal with the faint smile of a man who'd spent 40 years keeping other people's money safe. "A few," he'd said. "Diversified portfolio. Nothing you need to worry about." And I hadn't worried, because Vernon Thornton didn't make careless decisions. If there was something I needed to know, he'd tell me. He'll tell me if it matters, I'd thought, turning away from that locked door. He always does. That was the pattern. Trust the people I loved. Assume their silence protected me, rather than hid something I should question. The locked office became just another piece of my father's world I didn't need to understand. How many locked doors do we pass without knocking, trusting that if we needed to know what's inside, someone would tell us? How many times do we mistake discretion for protection, privacy for care? I learned to do the same thing. Keep parts of my life compartmentalized. Trust that the people I respected had good reasons for what they didn't share. Never press. Never demand transparency from those who'd earned my faith through years of quiet competence. That trust, once my foundation became the crack, everything else fell through. 9 years after I stopped asking about the locked office, I met Bryce Caldwell at a Baltimore networking event in a hotel ballroom that cost more per hour than most people made in a week. I was 32, senior financial analyst with a corner desk and a salary that proved I'd built something independent. Bryce moved through that crowded ballroom like he owned every conversation, every glance, a man who'd practiced charm until it looked effortless. Tailored suit, confident handshake, the kind of polish that came from studying what impressed people and delivering it with precision. He approached while I was calculating how early I could leave without seeming antisocial. "You don't belong in a room this boring," he'd said, holding 2 glasses of something amber that definitely wasn't the cheap wine they were serving. "Let me buy you a real drink." I should have caught it then, the rehearsed spontaneity, the way he'd positioned himself where I'd see him before he approached. But I was tired of networking events and careful men who talked about quarterly projections, and Bryce made me laugh. 3 dates later, my mother watched us from across her book club's spring luncheon with the kind of silence that meant she was seeing something I'd missed. Constance Thornton, 56 then, early 60s now, had spent 30 years as a watercolor artist with an eye that caught what polished surfaces tried to hide. She'd painted portraits for Baltimore's wealthiest families, capturing the impossible combination of success and humility, by seeing through performance to what people actually were. She pulled me aside after Bryce left to take a work call that I later realized was probably staged. "He's too polished, honey," she'd said, not quite looking at me. "Something feels rehearsed. Men with real substance have rough edges." I remember laughing. Actually laughing, like her concern was sweet but misplaced. "Mom, I'm 32, I'd said, with all the confidence of a woman who'd built a career on assessing risk. "I think I can judge character by now." She'd smiled sad, knowing, and let it drop. Because Constance Thornton didn't push. She offered her observations once, gently, and then trusted you to make your own mistakes. Just like Vernon with his locked office. Just like me with every warning sign I'd later wish I'd heeded. I can still hear my own laugh, dismissing her. Confident. So certain I knew better. The same certainty that had let me walk past Vernon's locked door my entire life without wondering what secrets successful men keep from the people they love. Bryce married me 8 months later. Constance painted us a watercolor of the Annapolis harbor as a wedding gift. Beautiful, technically perfect, and somehow melancholic, in a way I didn't understand until years later when I realized she'd been painting what she saw coming. Now, 6 years after dismissing her warning, I stood in my Baltimore apartment wearing long sleeves in July heat, and Vernon's question hung in the air between us, like an indictment of every time I'd trusted polish over substance, charm over character, locked doors over transparency. My mother had seen it. That night in the ballroom, across the spring luncheon table, probably the first time Bryce smiled at me with that rehearsed spontaneity. She'd seen the performance, and I'd laughed it off. Now, standing across from my father with his question still waiting for an answer, I finally understood what she'd recognized. But understanding comes too late when you're already wearing the bruises, when the charming man has spent 6 years teaching you that questioning him comes with consequences. The locked office, the polished smile. I'd trusted the wrong mysteries and dismissed the right warnings. And now there was only one question left. Would I finally tell the truth? The question sat between us, like a live wire, and every practiced lie I'd rehearsed for years dissolved under the weight of Vernon's unwavering gaze. My throat tightened with all the truths I'd swallowed. Every time I'd told friends I was clumsy, told coworkers I'd bumped into a cabinet, told my mother everything was fine over the phone while Bryce listened from the next room. Every smile I'd forced while wearing turtlenecks in summer, every excuse I'd perfected, every careful deflection that kept the bruises hidden and the marriage looking intact. The lies had felt like protection. Armor against judgment, against pity, against the humiliation of admitting I'd chosen wrong. But standing there with Vernon's question hanging in the air, I realized the lies hadn't protected me at all. They'd protected Bryce. Every day I stayed silent was another day he got away with it. Every excuse I made bought him more time to hurt me, while everyone around us believed the facade of the perfect marriage, the successful couple, the wife who was so lucky to have a husband going places. I opened my mouth to deflect, to say I'd bumped into the counter, slipped on the bathroom tile, been careless with a cabinet door. The lies were right there, polished smooth from years of use. But Vernon was still looking at me with that investor's precision, the same focus he probably gave to financial statements that didn't quite add up. And I was so tired of the math not working, of calculating how to hide and explain and justify. "My husband," I whispered. 2 words. That's all it took. 6 years of marriage, countless bruises, endless nights learning to read his footsteps and predict his moods reduced to 2 words that should never have to be said. Vernon didn't move, didn't blink. The air conditioning hummed. Outside, someone's car alarm chirped twice and went silent. "How long?" he asked, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that made the question feel dangerous. I pulled the cardigan tighter, even though the room was already too warm. 2 years, since he didn't get the promotion he wanted. He said I didn't support him enough, that I made him look weak in front of his colleagues. "The promotion at Meridian," Vernon said. Not a question. A statement that landed with the weight of knowledge I didn't understand yet. I nodded. I was silent for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not the rage I'd expected. Not the father's fury that would storm out and confront Bryce, make everything worse, give my husband one more reason to remind me why keeping secrets from family was the smarter choice. Instead, Vernon went still like ice, forming over deep water quiet, dangerous, absolute. "Does he know I'm here?" he asked. "No. He's at the office. He doesn't like me having visitors when he's not home." Another silence. Vernon's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in his controlled exterior. Then he moved to the window, looked out at Baltimore's afternoon skyline with his hands in his pockets, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted into something I recognized from childhood. The voice he used when he'd made a decision that was final, irreversible, already in motion before he announced it. "You're not staying here tonight," he said. "Dad, I can't just— You're not staying here," he repeated, turning to face me. "Pack what you need for a week. Documents, medications, anything that matters. You have 20 minutes before we leave." My chest tightened. "He'll notice. When he gets home and I'm gone, he'll— Let him notice." The certainty in those 3 words made my breath catch. Vernon wasn't asking, wasn't debating, wasn't offering suggestions I could weigh against the calculus of Bryce's potential reaction. "I was executing a plan. I need to make one call," he said, already reaching into his jacket pocket. Not for a handkerchief, to offer comfort. Not to check the time. His hand moved with the same deliberate precision he used to move millions between accounts, the practiced calm of a man who'd spent 40 years making decisions in high-stakes situations and never second-guessing once the analysis was complete. His phone emerged slim, expensive, the kind that handled international business calls and encrypted communications. He held it like it weighed more than it should, like the next 15 minutes contained more consequence than most people packed into a year. "One call," he said again, and the way the words landed made them sound final. Like a judge pronouncing sentence. Like an investor pulling funding from a failed venture. Like a father who just learned his silence about owning his son-in-law's company had enabled something unforgivable. "Who are you calling?" I asked. Vernon's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation meeting certainty. Strategy aligning with resources I didn't know he had positioned. "Someone who's been waiting for my authorization," he said, and moved toward the balcony door. I wanted to ask what that meant. Wanted to know who'd been waiting, what they were authorized to do. Why Vernon's voice carried the weight of decisions already made rather than plans still forming. But he was already sliding the glass door open, stepping out into the July heat with his phone rising to his ear. And I was left standing in my living room, wearing long sleeves and watching through the glass as my father made the most important call of my life. 15 minutes, I thought, watching him speak into the phone with that businesslike calm that had closed billion-dollar deals. 15 minutes to dismantle everything Bryce thought he controlled, starting with the job he didn't know his father-in-law had given him. He walked to the balcony door without another word, phone already at his ear. And what I heard through the glass in the next 15 minutes would rewrite everything I thought I knew about my father's quiet retirement. The first ring barely completed before someone answered. Vernon's voice dropped to the tone he probably used in boardrooms, calm, precise, carrying the weight of decisions that affected people's lives. "Desmond," he said, "execute Protocol 7, immediate termination, account freeze." I stood frozen in my living room, watching through the glass as my father spoke into his phone with the kind of authority that had nothing to do with parental concern and everything to do with corporate power. I didn't know he still wielded. "No," Vernon said, checking his watch. "Don't call him first. Let HR handle notification. I want it clean." Desmond. The name meant nothing to me. Protocol 7 meant even less. But the way Vernon spoke, issuing orders rather than making requests, referencing processes that sounded pre-planned rather than improvised, sent ice through my chest. Why was my retired father issuing corporate termination orders like a CEO who never left the boardroom? Clause 7, Employment Contract, Vernon continued. Termination for cause, effective immediately. No severance, no references. Freeze all company accounts he has access to. He paused, listening to whatever Desmond was saying on the other end. Through the glass, I watched Vernon's expression remain perfectly controlled. Not the face of a father responding to his daughter's abuse, but an investor executing a plan that had been waiting for the right trigger. The financial discrepancies from Q2, Vernon said. Use those as initial justification. We'll discuss the rest later. Financial discrepancies. Q2. The language of quarterly reports and corporate oversight, not family crisis. Vernon ended the call and stood on the balcony for a long moment, looking out at Baltimore like he could see all the pieces moving into position across the city. Then he checked his watch again, the expensive one he'd worn to every important business meeting I could remember, and came back inside. Sit down, he said, and it wasn't a request. I sat. Vernon settled into the chair across from me with the same deliberate calm he'd shown since arriving. No rage, no visible fury at what I'd confessed. Just the methodical focus of a man who'd spent decades making high-stakes decisions and never second-guessing once the analysis was complete. I own controlling stake in Meridian Logistics, he said. Bryce works for me. He just never knew it. The words landed like physical blows. I opened my mouth, closed it, tried to process the impossible arithmetic of what he'd just said. You, what? 63% ownership, Vernon continued, as if reciting quarterly earnings. Acquired it 8 years ago as part of a distressed asset purchase, before you even met your husband. 8 years. Before the networking event. Before Bryce's polished smile and practiced charm. Before I'd dismissed my mother's warning and married a man who worked for a company my father owned. The locked office door from my childhood suddenly made perfect sense. He wasn't hiding secrets from me. He was protecting my independence from his power. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. Vernon's expression softened slightly. Because you asked me not to. When you were 24 and starting your analyst certification, you specifically requested I not use my connections to help your career. You wanted to succeed independently. I honored that. I remembered. The conversation in his Annapolis study. My youthful determination to prove I could build something without riding his reputation. The locked door I'd never questioned because I'd trusted his discretion. So when Bryce got hired there, I stayed silent, Vernon said, respecting your wishes. Even when you got engaged, even at the wedding, I never mentioned it. I thought you'd chosen well enough on your own. The weight in those last words carried years of regret. How long have you known about the money? I asked, because the way he'd referenced financial discrepancies on the phone suggested this wasn't new information. Vernon's jaw tightened. 3 months. The Q2 reports flagged irregularities in vendor payments. My corporate attorney started an internal audit. We've been building documentation falsified invoices, unauthorized account transfers. He's been embezzling to cover gambling debts. 3 months. Vernon had been tracking my husband's crimes through quarterly financial reports while I'd been hiding bruises and calculating how to survive dinner being 17 minutes late. All these years, I thought I'd built my career alone, but my father had been standing in the shadows with a safety net I never saw. And when that career was destroyed by a forged resignation letter, when Bryce had sabotaged everything I'd worked for, Vernon had still been there, watching through corporate oversight, building a case against the man who'd taken his daughter's independence and weaponized it. The Bruises, Vernon said quietly, just moved up my timeline. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just my father, but the investor who'd turned 12 million into 60 million through disciplined analysis and perfect timing. The man who'd spent 3 months building an embezzlement case while waiting for me to be ready to leave. He'd been preparing my exit before I knew I needed one. Vernon glanced at his watch one more time. 12 minutes since he'd hung up. 15 minutes, he said. Then you'll understand. Somewhere across Baltimore, in the logistics office where my husband sat in his false director's chair, phones were ringing. HR was walking down hallways, and Bryce had no idea the man who just destroyed his career was the same quiet investor who'd shaken his hand at our wedding 6 years ago and said nothing about owning the company that would eventually expose every crime Bryce thought he'd hidden. 3 minutes until Bryce's world ended, and my father had orchestrated every second of it across Baltimore in an office he thought he owned. My husband's phone was ringing with the call that would strip away every lie he'd built his life on. Vernon's phone chimed. He glanced at the screen, read the text with the same calm he'd shown since arriving, then looked up at me. Desmond confirms. Termination executed at 2:47. Accounts frozen. He's calling you. As if on cue, my phone buzzed on the counter. Bryce's name lit up the screen. I stared at it, watching it vibrate against the marble. Don't answer, Vernon said. I hadn't planned to. But my hand moved toward it anyway, 6 years of conditioning that said, ignoring his calls came with consequences. Vernon's hand covered mine before I reached it. Let it ring. The call went to voicemail. 30 seconds of silence. Then it buzzed again. Same name, same insistence. He never calls this much unless I stopped. Unless he's losing control, Vernon finished. Which he is, completely. Another buzz. Another call. I counted them like I used to count his footsteps in the hallway, trying to gauge his mood. 4 calls. 6. 11. Every buzz of my phone was him unraveling the same phone he'd used to track my every move, to demand explanations for grocery trips that took 17 minutes instead of 15. Now that phone was screaming his desperation into silence, and I was the one choosing not to answer. The power reversal was so complete it felt surreal. What's he thinking right now? I asked. Vernon checked his phone again. According to Desmond, HR informed him of immediate suspension pending investigation into financial irregularities. They've frozen his corporate accounts, revoked building access. He has no idea who triggered the audit or why the timing is today. He'll know I left, I said, when he comes home and I'm gone. He won't be coming home, Vernon interrupted. Not to this apartment. Desmond arranged for building security to change the locks within the hour. Your name stays on the lease. His doesn't. I blinked. You can do that? The lease is in your name. Has been since you moved in. He's been living here under your authorization, which you're now revoking. Building management has the paperwork already. This morning, before I'd confessed, before Vernon had asked his direct question, he'd been preparing contingencies before I'd even admitted I needed them. Vernon orchestrates my escape. Like moving pieces on a board, he's been studying for months, every contingency already mapped, every variable accounted for, every possible response from Bryce anticipated and countered. My phone kept buzzing. 15 calls. 17. Pack light, Vernon said, standing. Documents, cash, anything he can't replace that matters to you. Birth certificate, passport, social security card, jewelry with sentimental value. Everything else can be retrieved later under police escort if necessary. Where am I going? Somewhere safe, he said. A hotel outside the city. Desmond will come at 7 to drive you. Corporate account, registered under a trust name. Bryce won't be able to track it. 7 p.m. 4 hours from now. 4 hours to pack up 6 years of marriage and walk away from everything Bryce had convinced me I couldn't survive without. What about... I stopped because the list of complications was endless. The shared bank account, the car title, the friends who'd believe whatever story he told them. One thing at a time, Vernon said, reading my spiraling thoughts. Right now, you pack. At 7, you leave. Tomorrow, we handle the legal documentation. Everything else follows once you're safe. He said it like safety was a destination I'd reach in 4 hours rather than a concept that had eroded so gradually I could barely remember what it felt like. Do you trust me? Vernon asked. 6 hours ago, I wore long sleeves to hide the truth even from myself. I'd spent 2 years calculating survival, measuring my words, timing my movements, perfecting the lies that kept neighbors from asking questions. I'd dismissed my mother's warnings, ignored every red flag, trusted the wrong man because his polish looked like substance. Now my father was asking if I trusted him to dismantle my husband's world with the same precision Bryce had used to dismantle mine. Yes, I said, and meant it. Vernon nodded once, decisive. Then go pack. Be ready by 7. Desmond is someone I've worked with for 15 years. He'll get you there safely. He left to make more arrangements, telling me to rest if I could, knowing I wouldn't. My phone sat on this counter, still buzzing with Bryce's calls, now 23 and counting. Each one a small demonstration of powerlessness. A man who'd controlled everything through violence now screaming into the void, because the person he'd terrorized had finally found someone with more power than his fists. In 4 hours, someone I'd never met would knock on this door to take me somewhere Bryce couldn't find me. And somewhere across Baltimore, my husband was learning what it felt like when the world you thought you controlled revealed. It was never yours at all, that the job you strutted into was given by a man you'd never met, that the power you wielded was borrowed without your knowledge, that the wife you'd beaten into silence had a father who could destroy you with one 15-minute phone call. But before I could escape forward, I needed to understand how I got here, waiting for escape in the present. I forced myself to remember when escape seemed unnecessary, when I mistook his jealousy for devotion and his control for care. 2002. Our first apartment after the wedding. A 1-bedroom in East Baltimore that cost half what the high-rise would later run us. Small kitchen, smaller living room, windows overlooking a parking lot. I was 33, still working as a financial analyst, still believing I'd married someone who would celebrate my success. Bryce started with my friendships. "Why do you need happy hours with Chloe?" he asked one Thursday when I mentioned meeting my colleague for drinks after an audit deadline. "You have me now? Isn't that enough?" He said it while chopping vegetables, not looking up, voice casual. But there was something underneath the current I couldn't quite name. "It's just work friends unwinding," I said. "Chloe is using you," he said, still not looking up. "She wants your analyst connections, your reputation. People like that don't actually care about you." I'd canceled the happy hour. Not because I believed him, I told myself. Just because it seemed easier than the strange tension in our small kitchen, the way his knife hit the cutting board a little harder than necessary. When did he want me all to himself become something I defended instead of feared? I did it gradually, one friendship at a time, one colleague I stopped having lunch with, one former classmate whose calls I let go to voicemail because explaining why I couldn't meet felt more exhausting than just staying home. Within 6 months, my social circle had contracted to Bryce's colleagues, Bryce's friends, gatherings where I played the supportive wife and smiled through conversations about logistics operations I didn't care about. The dinner party was the first time he humiliated me publicly. We were at his regional director's house, expensive suburb, catered meal, the kind of networking event where advancement lived and died on impressions. I'd mentioned a presentation I'd given that week on municipal bond restructuring. Bryce laughed. Not the warm laugh from our dating months, but something sharper. "Honey, that presentation you gave?" he said, loud enough for the director and his wife to hear. "Everyone knows it needed work. I'm just being honest. You're lucky they didn't ask harder questions." The table went quiet. Then someone changed the subject, and the moment passed. I laughed along when he humiliated me in front of strangers. I actually apologized later for embarrassing him with my subpar work, told him I'd do better next time, asked what I could have improved, absorbed his critique like it was mentorship instead of calculated cruelty. That's what abuse does in the beginning. It masquerades as concern, as improvement, and if you're not careful, you start doing the work for them. You start dismantling yourself. 2 months after the dinner party, Bryce came home with news about temporary money troubles. A deal that hadn't closed, a commission check delayed. "I'm taking your father's watch to the jeweler," he said, holding the timepiece Vernon had given me the morning of our wedding. Expensive, sentimental. The inscription read, "Time to build your own life. Love, Dad." "Why?" I asked. It needs cleaning, Bryce said smoothly. And the jeweler offered to do a full service check the mechanism, polish the crystal. 2 weeks, tops. You trust me, right? I trusted him. My father gave me that watch the morning of my wedding time, he said, to build my own life. Bryce sold it to a pawn shop 2 years into our marriage, traded it for cash to cover gambling debts I didn't know existed, and told me the jeweler needed extra time for repairs that were never happening. 2 weeks became a month. A month became 3. Every time I asked, he had an excuse. The jeweler was backed up. They'd ordered a special part. It would be ready next week, next month, soon. I believed him, because the alternative was believing my husband had stolen something irreplaceable and lied with the same casual confidence he'd used to isolate me from friends and humiliate me at dinner parties. 6 months into marriage, I asked about the watch one more time. Bryce was reading something on his phone, half watching television. I brought it up gently, just wondering when he thought it might be ready. He snapped. Not physically, not yet. But something in his voice changed, went cold and sharp and dangerous in a way I'd never heard before. Stop asking about the damn watch, he said, not looking up. I'll get it when I get it. Why don't you trust me? Is that what this marriage is going to be? Constant nagging? I backed down immediately, apologized, never asked again. I didn't know then that silence was rehearsal for what came next. That learning not to question him about small thefts was practice for not questioning him about bigger violations. That the edge in his voice was a preview of the edge in his fists, and I was being trained to accept both. 3 years later, the edge in his voice found his hands. But in 2019, standing in our small kitchen backing away from a question about a watch, I told myself this was just marriage, just adjustment, just learning to navigate someone else's sensitivities. I told myself a lot of things in those early years. None of them were true. The first time Bryce hit me, it was December 3 years into a marriage. I thought I understood. 20 minutes after a conversation I didn't know would cost me everything. Company holiday party at a downtown hotel. Catered dinner, open bar. The kind of forced festivity where colleagues pretend to enjoy each other's company outside quarterly reviews. I was 35, still working as a financial analyst, still believing the isolation and humiliation were just rough patches we'd get through. I'd been talking to Marcus, a colleague from the accounting software division, about a system integration proposal I'd drafted. Purely professional, witnessed by dozens of people in a ballroom full of witnesses. 20 minutes of conversation about data migration and API compatibility. Bryce watched from across the room. I didn't notice until later how his jaw had tightened, how his knuckles had gone white around his drink glass. The car ride home was silent, not the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill space. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your chest and makes you measure your breathing. I watched his hands on the steering wheel white-knuckled, tendons visible, gripping like the leather might escape. It was just work talk, I said, breaking the quiet, not sure why I felt the need to explain, but knowing somehow that I should. I didn't respond, just drove. The city lights blurred past. Christmas decorations strung across buildings we'd driven past 1,000 times before. We pulled into our apartment building's garage, took the elevator in silence, walked down the hallway with our footsteps echoing off walls that suddenly felt too close. The door to our apartment barely closed before he turned. 20 minutes, he said. You spent 20 minutes talking to him. I counted. About software integration, Marcus's. The sound of his hand hitting my face was louder than I expected. Then silence. Then the wall against my spine. My vision whited out. Not from pain that came later, but from shock. The same man who'd charmed me at a networking event, who'd cried at our wedding, who'd promised to love me through everything, had just hit me with enough force that I tasted copper. I slid down the wall, sat on our entryway floor, hand against my cheek, trying to process what had just happened. Bryce dropped to his knees, not threatening, Not advancing. He collapsed like his strings had been cut, and the sound that came out of him was something between a sob and a scream. "I don't know what happened," he gasped, reaching for me, pulling back when I flinched. "I swear to God, I blacked out. I would never." I was crying. Actually crying, shoulders shaking, face in his hands, the kind of tears that look like they hurt. He's crying harder than I am. Some broken part of my brain thinks, he must really be sorry. He must really love me if this hurts him too. "I'll get help," he said, looking up at me with red eyes and a face twisted in what looked like genuine anguish. "Tomorrow. I'll call a therapist tomorrow. I'll figure out what's wrong with me. Please, it will never happen again. I swear on my mother's grave, it will never happen again." His mother had died when he was 16. He'd told me once it was the worst thing that ever happened to him, that he'd promised at her funeral to be a better man than his father. Now he was swearing on her grave that he wouldn't hit me again. "This was a mistake," I heard myself saying, words coming from somewhere outside my body. "Just once. He wouldn't," except he had. He just did. The evidence was swelling on my cheekbone, the taste of blood in my mouth, the way my hands were shaking as I tried to stand. But he was sobbing, promising therapy, invoking his dead mother. And I'd spent 3 years learning that questioning him came with consequences, that giving him the benefit of the doubt was easier than confronting hard truths, that love meant forgiveness. So I forgave him. I forgave him the way you'd forgive a car accident. Terrible, traumatic, but singular. A moment of lost control that would never repeat, because we'd both learned from it, because he'd get help, because people who really loved each other worked through hard things. I didn't know yet that some accidents are test runs, that tears can be tactical, that promising therapy tomorrow is different from actually making the appointment, keeping it, doing the work. He held me that night, whispered apologies into my hair, promised he'd be better. And some part of me, the part that had dismissed my mother's warnings, that had rationalized away the isolation and humiliation, that had learned to make myself smaller to make him comfortable, believed him. Because the alternative was accepting that the man I'd married was capable of calculated violence, that the tears were performance, that I'd just set a precedent that would define the next 3 years of my life. He kept his promise for exactly 94 days. I know because I counted each one like a reprieve, like proof I'd been right to forgive, like evidence that love and second chances could overcome one terrible mistake. On day 985, when his fist found my ribs instead of his open palm, I realized the tears had been part of the performance. The therapy appointment had never been made. The promise on his mother's grave was just words he knew would work. The question wasn't whether it would happen again. It was how long until I stopped counting the days between, until violence became the baseline and peace became the exception. The cycle had its own gravity now, and I was already caught in its orbit. I stopped counting days after the 3rd time, because the math was telling me a story I didn't want to read. 94 days, then 63, then 41, a countdown to something that had no bottom. The 2nd time, he punched the wall beside my head, left a hole in the drywall I had to explain to building maintenance as moving furniture. 63 days after the first. 63 days of believing the tears had meant something. He cried again. Same script, same promises. "I'll get help. It won't happen again. I don't know what's wrong with me." I believed him again. Because the alternative was accepting I'd forgiven violence once and enabled it to return. 3rd time, 41 days. He shoved me into the kitchen counter hard enough to leave bruises across my hip bone. Purple-green reminders that the intervals were shrinking. When does the exception become the rule? When does "this time will be different" become a lie you're telling yourself? By late 2022, I stopped asking. The intervals had compressed to weeks, then days. The pattern had found its rhythm, and I'd become fluent in its language. Tension, explosion, apology, honeymoon, repeat. The tension phase I learned to read in his footsteps. Heavy meant bad day at work. Deliberate meant he was looking for something to criticize. Silent meant the storm was building, and I should make myself invisible. The explosion could be triggered by anything. Dinner. 17 minutes late. A colleague's name mentioned twice. The wrong tone when I said good morning. My offense became irrelevant. The violence needed no real justification, just an excuse he could cite when explaining why I'd made him do it. The apology phase grew shorter, more mechanical. He'd stopped crying by mid-2023. Just went through the motions because the script worked, because "I'm sorry, it won't happen again, I swear," had earned forgiveness twice, and therefore would earn it indefinitely. "I'm sorry," he'd say, not meeting my eyes. "It won't happen again, I swear." But the words had lost their weight. Become ritual rather than remorse. I became a meteorologist of his moods, tracking pressure systems, predicting storms, seeking shelter before the first drop fell. My analyst's brain, trained to spot patterns in financial data, now focused entirely on survival calculus. Footsteps in the hallway. I could tell his mood from the cadence. Quick and light meant neutral. Heavy and deliberate meant run the dinner timing calculation. Was it ready exactly when he expected? Keys hitting the entry table. Gentle placement meant safe evening. Thrown meant I had maybe 20 minutes before he found something wrong. Door closing. Soft click meant he was in control. Slam meant get out of his sight line, make yourself small. Don't speak unless spoken to. Breakfast silence. I learned to read whether he wanted conversation or solitude, whether asking about his day would be care or nagging. By early 2023, I developed expertise I never wanted. I could predict his violence within 30 seconds of hearing his key in the lock. Could calculate which shirt would provoke the least reaction. Not too professional. Showing off. Not too casual. Letting yourself go. Not too fitted. Who are you dressing for? Not too loose. You've given up. I knew which topics were safe, which friends' names I could mention, which work stories would make him feel superior rather than threatened. I knew to time grocery trips to 15 minutes maximum, to save receipts proving I'd gone nowhere else, to keep my phone location services on so he could verify my movements. By 2023, I could tell you if he'd be violent within 30 seconds of hearing his key in the lock. That's not strength. That's captivity with a vocabulary. My intelligence. The same analytical precision that had earned me senior analyst positions had been repurposed entirely for survival. Instead of projecting bond yields, I projected his moods. Instead of identifying market inefficiencies, I identified which behaviors would minimize violence. The career I'd built, the independence I'd fought for, the capabilities I'd developed, all of it now served one purpose: making it through each day with the fewest bruises possible. I stopped going to happy hours, stopped mentioning work achievements, stopped having opinions about anything that mattered. Became so small and quiet and careful that I barely recognized the woman who'd once dismissed her mother's warnings with confident certainty. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the exhaustion, the constant calculation, the way every moment required threat assessment and risk management. The way I couldn't turn off the vigilance even when he wasn't home, because not being prepared when he returned was its own form of danger. The morning I realized I'd spent an entire shower calculating which shirt would provoke the least reaction, which breakfast timing would minimize risk, which route through our apartment avoided his line of sight that morning, I understood I wasn't living with him anymore. I was surviving him, and survival took every ounce of intelligence I'd once used to build a career he was about to take from me. Year 4 would cost me more than bruises. It would cost me the last piece of independence I had left, the financial analyst's salary that represented the only life I'd built without his permission. But I didn't know that yet. Still believed if I just calculated perfectly enough, predicted accurately enough, made myself small enough, I could survive my way through this until something changed. I didn't understand that survival isn't sustainable when the threat lives in your own home and knows exactly which parts of you are already broken. Year 4 would cost me my career, the last piece of independence I hadn't yet learned to surrender. 2022. I was 36, still clinging to my financial analyst position, like it was the last proof I existed outside Bryce's control. It was. And he'd been watching that independence, calculating when and how to take it. He started by reframing my salary as a stressor. "You're exhausted," he said one evening after I'd worked late. He'd set out wine glasses, dimmed the lights, created intimate concern. "I worry about you. This job is destroying your health." I had papers spread across the coffee table. Job listings, administrative assistant positions with better hours and less responsibility, roles that wouldn't require late nights, positions that would give me time to focus on our marriage, maybe starting a family. I recognized the tactic, the same loving concern he'd used to isolate me from friends. But this time, I saw it clearly. This wasn't about my stress. It was about eliminating the only income I controlled. "I like my job," I said carefully, measuring the response. "You say that," he replied, sipping wine. "But I see how it affects you. The anxiety, the sleep problems. Don't you want a life where you're not constantly under pressure?" The anxiety and sleep problems came from living with him. From midnight interrogations about who I'd spoken to at work. From hypervigilance that made closing my eyes feel dangerous. From calculating every word to avoid triggering violence. But I couldn't say that, so I said I'd think about it. Looking back from July 2024, I understand this moment as the beginning of total financial dependency. Without income, I couldn't afford an apartment deposit, couldn't hire a divorce lawyer, couldn't even buy a burner phone. Economic abuse creates the cage that makes physical abuse inescapable. Bryce knew that. That's why he'd been planning this for weeks. 2 days later, he presented the resignation letter. Not a draft. A completed document, professionally formatted, addressed to my manager. I stood in our living room throw pillows in Restoration Hardware's fog gray that Bryce had selected. Camus Cabernet breathing on the counter. Refrigerator humming at 42 hertz, and read my own resignation. "I took the liberty of drafting this," he said, voice gentle. "I know change is hard. I wanted to make it easier." The letter cited personal health reasons and family planning priorities. He'd researched my company's 2-week notice period and drafted language about transitioning my projects. He'd even thanked my manager for understanding. "I haven't decided to quit," I said. "I know," he said, expression shifting to wounded. "I'm just trying to help. Don't you trust my judgment? We're supposed to be partners." The pivot to hurt feelings, the suggestion that my hesitation betrayed our partnership rather than resisted his control. "Your career is making you hard," he continued. "Unfeminine. I miss the woman I married, the one who had time for us." The woman he married had existed for exactly 6 months before the isolation started. The soft, available version he was describing had never been real. "I'll think about it," I said, because agreeing to think was safer than outright refusal. He smiled, kissed my forehead, said that's all he wanted for me to consider what would make me happiest. 2 weeks later, I was packing my desk at the financial firm. I'd never submitted the resignation. Had been rehearsing how to tell Bryce I'd decided to keep my position, calculating how to frame it while maintaining this one boundary. HR handed me the exit paperwork. I signed what needed signing, then glanced at the resignation letter clipped to the file. The signature wasn't mine. Close. But the capital L curved wrong. The finalin had a flourish I never used. Someone had practiced my signature and forged the document while I was thinking about it. Bryce had submitted my resignation without telling me. I opened my mouth to say something fraud, forgery, criminal charges, but the shared laptop on my desk chimed with an email notification. The preview showed outstanding balance, discretionary fund coverage. The sender, V. Thornton, Vernon. My father, who I rarely spoke with these days, who Bryce claimed never to have contacted. I clicked. The email chain loaded. Correspondence between Bryce and Vernon about a 2019 business loss I'd never heard of. Discussions about discretionary funds and coverage amounts. Language suggesting my father had paid off some debt on Bryce's behalf. My manager knocked. Time for the exit interview. If you're wondering why I didn't confront him about the forgery right then, why I didn't report fraud or call a lawyer, you've never calculated the cost of making an abuser desperate. I had no savings he didn't control, no separate credit, no family to call. And I'd just glimpsed evidence he had some connection to the father I'd cut off. The smartest financial analyst in my graduating class couldn't afford the price of her own safety. I smiled at my manager and lied about exciting new opportunities, while the two men I should have been able to trust negotiated the terms of my cage behind screens I'd never see. I woke to Bryce's voice at 2 a.m., not the controlled baritone he used to choreograph my days, but something I'd never heard before. Fear. June 2024. A month before Vernon would appear at my door with the question that would change everything. But that night, I was still trapped in the calculation, still counting minutes, still believing survival was the same as living. Bryce was pacing the hallway, phone pressed to his ear, voice low and urgent. I lay still, listening. I need 3 weeks, he whispered. If Vernon follows through on his threat, Vernon, the father I had barely spoken to in months. The V. Thornton from the email I'd glimpsed when Bryce forged my resignation. Now central to whatever panic had my husband pacing at 2 a.m. The shortfall, Bryce continued. I can cover it before audits if you just give me 3 weeks. The borrowed funds? He stopped. Noticed the bedroom door was open, that I might be awake. I'll call you tomorrow, he said, ending the call. He came to the doorway. I closed my eyes, performed sleep. Just warehouse inventory problems, baby, he said to the dark room. Go back to sleep. I didn't ask about it in the morning. Didn't research the connection. Didn't check his phone. You're wondering why not. But you haven't calculated the survival math. Checking his devices risked triggering exactly the violence that arrived 3 days later. And without my analyst's salary, I had no resources to act on information anyway. Knowledge without power is just another form of captivity. 3 days later, I served dinner at 6:47 instead of 6:30. 17 minutes late because the grocery store line had been longer than usual, because traffic had backed up, because small variables beyond my control had made precise timing impossible. Bryce stood in the kitchen doorway, checking his watch. 17 minutes, he said. 17 minutes you decided your time matters more than mine. The grocery store. I don't care about the grocery store. I care that you can't follow simple instructions. Dinner at 6:30, not 6:47. How hard is that? I knew what was coming from the way he moved into the kitchen. Knew from the set of his shoulders, the tone that had gone cold. My survival calculations activated Map the Room. Identify exits. Calculate whether resistance or capitulation minimize damage. The first blow hit my ribs. Calculated placement, nothing that would show in short sleeves. The second targeted my upper arm, the kind of bruising work clothes would cover. Methodical, precise. A man who'd learned exactly how to hurt me without leaving visible evidence. When it stopped, I was on the kitchen floor, tasting blood from where I'd bitten my tongue. I wouldn't lose control if you just follow simple rules, he said, breathing hard. Say it. I compared the psychological script to my old financial modeling. Input variables, my mistakes. Fixed formula, his violence. Required output, my confession of fault. My analyst's brain tried to create order from trauma, tried to apply the skills he'd destroyed to understanding the pattern destroying me. Say it, he repeated. I caused this, I whispered. I disrespected your schedule. That's right, you did this. Remember that. He left me on the floor, went to the bedroom. I heard the shower start washing off the evidence. The next morning, I went to work. Administrative coordinator at a property management firm, the job I'd taken after he sabotaged my analyst career. At the copy machine, reaching for papers, my sleeves shifted. Nadine Foster, mid-40s administrative coordinator who'd worked there 3 years longer than me, was standing beside the printer. I saw her eyes track to my upper arm, to the purple-green fingerprint pattern long sleeves were supposed to hide. I froze, calculated the cover story clumsy with the car door, bumped into a cabinet, but Nadine's expression wasn't shock. It was recognition. That pattern, she said quietly. Upper arms, ribs probably, careful placement, someone who knows how to hit where it won't show. Not a question, a statement from someone who'd seen this before. It's complicated, I heard myself say. It always is, Nadine replied. Her voice carried no judgment, no pity, just the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood the calculations I'd been making. When you're ready, I'm in cube 47. She took her copies and walked away. You're waiting for me to follow her to cube 47, to pour out 6 years of captivity to someone who clearly understands. But you haven't calculated what I had Bryce tracking my phone location, monitoring my work computer, timing my commute. Nadine's kindness was a door I couldn't afford to walk through yet. I watched her return to her desk. The first person in 6 years who'd looked at my bruises and seen a pattern instead of an accident. Not the sanitized version I performed for neighbors, but the methodical truth written on my skin. The knowing look in Nadine's eyes suggested either personal survival or professional expertise, and I couldn't decide which possibility terrified me more, that she'd lived through this herself, or that she'd been trained to identify it and might report what she'd seen. For the first time since Bryce forged my resignation, someone knew, really knew, and I didn't know if that made me safer or put me in more danger. The memory of Nadine's knowing eyes dissolved as I returned to the present, to this Thursday morning in July 2024, standing in my bedroom with a single carry-on suitcase open on the bed. My hands trembled as I folded the navy sweater Dad had bought me 3 Christmases ago, back when I could still accept gifts without Bryce interrogating me about brand names and receipts. You have 47 minutes, Desmond had texted at 6:18 a.m. Your husband's calendar shows a 9 a.m. deposition downtown. He left the building at 8:02. I had never told Desmond about Bryce's schedule. The twist of understanding hit me. Then Dad's people had been watching far longer than the 3 days since Vernon's visit. I moved through the apartment with surgical precision, taking only what I'd memorized during sleepless nights. 3 pairs of jeans, 5 shirts, underwear and socks. My grandmother's silver locket from the jewelry box, leaving behind every piece Bryce had given me. In the bathroom, I grabbed my prescription bottles and the travel toiletries I'd hidden behind the cleaning supplies 2 months ago, when some desperate part of me had started planning without admitting I was planning. The closet floor safe sat behind my winter boots. Bryce didn't know I'd watched him enter the combination 100 times, didn't know I'd been skimming grocery money and birthday checks for 6 years. My fingers worked the dial. 14/27/03, his Harvard graduation date, because Bryce made everything about Bryce. The safe clicked open. Inside, rubber-banded stacks of cash sat exactly as I'd left them. I counted quickly, $3,847. 6 years of $20 here, $50 there. Every bill a tiny act of treason. I stuffed the money into a zippered pocket inside the suitcase lining. How do you measure the weight of freedom? $3,000 felt heavier than 6 years of bruises. In the kitchen, I paused at the island where I'd served dinner 17 minutes late a month ago. The marble still gleamed, recently cleaned. I'd scrubbed my own blood off this counter the next morning while Bryce read the Wall Street Journal and drank French press coffee, not speaking, his silence more threatening than his fists. I slid my wedding ring off the 2-carat diamond Bryce had chosen without asking my preference, mounted in platinum so heavy it had given me headaches for months. The ring clicked against marble as I set it down precisely where my dinner plate had been that night. Let him find it there. Let him understand. My phone buzzed. 31 minutes. Exit via service elevator. Lobby will be clear. I grabbed my suitcase, took one final look at the prison I'd called home, and left without locking the door behind me. The service elevator descended in silence. I watched the floor numbers drop, 18, 17, 16, each one carrying me further from Bryce's reach. My reflection in the brushed steel doors showed a woman I barely recognized. Thinner than my wedding photos, older than 38, but with something new in her eyes that looked almost like hope. Desmond waited in the lobby exactly as promised, positioned near the service corridor where the building's security cameras had a convenient blind spot. He wore a different suit than Tuesday charcoal gray, custom-tailored, and held a tablet that made him look like any other corporate executive checking morning emails. "Ms. Thornton," he said quietly, taking my suitcase. "The car is ready." "How long?" I asked as we walked toward the garage entrance. How long has my father been watching? Desmond's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, respect, maybe, or approval. Mr. Thornton has had financial oversight of Mr. Caldwell's role since 2019. Concrete evidence of embezzlement surfaced 3 months ago. 3 months? I stopped walking. Dad's known for 3 months? He's known about the embezzlement for 3 months, Desmond corrected gently. He's had oversight of Mr. Caldwell since he hired him in 2019, and he's known about the domestic situation for much longer. But he couldn't act without your consent, Ms. Thornton. The legal exposure, the risk of pushing you further away, he had to wait until you were ready. The implications settled over me like ice water. Dad had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. And he'd been preparing, gathering evidence, building cases, placing people in position. While I'd been stealing grocery money and hiding toiletries, Vernon Thornton had been orchestrating something far larger. What financial irregularities? I asked. Desmond's smile was thin and sharp. Let's get you somewhere safe first. Then your father can explain exactly how deep Mr. Caldwell's problems run. He opened the rear door of a black sedan tinted windows, diplomatic plates I couldn't quite read. I slid inside, and the door closed with the heavy, final sound of a vault sealing shut. We pulled into morning traffic, and through the rear window, I watched my building disappear. Somewhere above us, Bryce would return from his deposition to find an empty apartment and a wedding ring on the kitchen counter. But by then, I'd be in a place he couldn't follow, protected by a father whose power I'd spent 6 years underestimating. The question wasn't whether I was safe now. The question was what Vernon had planned for Bryce and whether I was ready to watch my father destroy the man I'd once loved. The safe location turned out to be a courtyard Marriott 30 miles outside the city, registered under a name I didn't recognize. I'd spent the night staring at ceiling tiles, listening to highway traffic, trying to convince myself that freedom was supposed to feel this anonymous and temporary. Vernon arrived at 8 the next morning with coffee and a garment bag. "Dr. Kelsey is expecting you at 9:15, he said, setting a tall latte on the desk, skim milk, extra shot, no sweetener. My exact order. She specializes in forensic documentation for protective orders. I took the coffee. You scheduled this 4 days ago, before I left. I scheduled it when Desmond confirmed the June beating escalation. Vernon unzipped the garment bag, revealing clothes still tagged blouse, slacks, cardigan, all in my size. I've been waiting for you to be ready. The precision landed like a fist. He'd bought clothes in my exact measurements, ordered coffee the way I'd taken it since college, booked a physician who specialized in documenting the specific flavor of suffering I'd endured. Vernon hadn't reacted to my escape, he'd choreographed it. What if I hadn't been ready 4 days ago? Then I would have rescheduled. He checked his watch, Patek Philippe, platinum. We have 40 minutes. The clinic is in Annapolis. I pulled on the new clothes, felt the fabric settle against bruises Vernon had known about for weeks, and followed him to the car. During the drive, I watched Maryland's suburbs blur past and tried to untangle gratitude from resentment. Vernon had saved me. Vernon had also predicted me, prepared for me, built an entire infrastructure around the assumption that I'd eventually break. The control felt different from Bryce's, funded by private equity instead of rage, executed through corporate precision instead of fists, but it was still control. Is being saved by someone who scheduled your rescue better than not being saved at all? I didn't know. I just knew the coffee was perfect, and I hated that it was perfect. The clinic occupied a renovated townhouse near the Naval Academy, discreet signage, no indication it specialized in cataloging violence. Dr. Monica Kelsey met us in a consultation room that looked more like a boutique hotel than a medical facility. Soft lighting, abstract art, furniture designed to minimize institutional trauma. She was mid-40s, silver-streaked dark hair pulled back, wearing scrubs that somehow looked tailored. A physician specializing in forensic domestic violence documentation, though I didn't know yet that she'd been coordinating with Vernon's legal team for months. "Ms. Thornton," she said, using the name I hadn't legally carried in 6 years. "I understand you're seeking documentation for a protective order filing." "My father understands that," I said quietly. "I'm just here." Something shifted in Dr. Kelsey's eyes, recognition of the difference between choosing and complying. "Then let's document what's here. You can decide what to do with the information later." The examination took 40 minutes. She photographed each injury with forensic precision, narrating findings into a handheld recorder while maintaining eye contact. Upper left arm, 4 distinct ovoid contusions consistent with fingertip pressure. Yellow-green coloring indicates approximately a month of healing. About a month. The night after I'd overheard Bryce's panicked phone call about Vernon and the shortfall. Lateral rib cage, diffuse bruising with purple and yellow coloring. Approximately 14 days healing, consistent with blunt force trauma. 2 weeks. The morning I'd asked about his meeting with federal investigators. Right wrist, linear contusions with brown coloring. Approximately 7 days healing. Pattern consistent with restraint. 1 week. When I'd tried to leave the bedroom during an argument. Left shoulder blade, deep purple and red bruising. Approximately 36 hours healing. The morning before I'd left. The last time. Dr. Kelsey lowered her camera. The pattern across healing stages documents repeated meant. A single fight could be mutual. A rainbow of healing bruises proved sustained pattern, proved predator and prey. The color-coded timeline written across my skin was evidence Bryce couldn't explain away. But here's what I wanted to ask. Vernon scheduled this appointment the same week these bruises formed. He knew I was being beaten in June and waited until it built a stronger legal case before extracting me. Which version of protection is that? Dr. Kelsey printed the preliminary report and collated pages. Then, almost casually, "I'll cross-reference these findings with the workplace documentation provided by Mr. Thornton's legal team." My spine went rigid. Workplace documentation? The incident reports. 3 separate observations between March and June 2024, filed by Nadine Foster, Human Resources Coordinator. You already had Nadine's reports when I walked in today. Vernon, who'd been waiting in the consultation room, didn't look up from his phone. "I told you I've been waiting for you to be ready." The evidence was always here. Dr. Kelsey sealed the folder in a larger envelope, handed it to Vernon rather than me. He placed it in a leather portfolio I hadn't noticed him carrying. The label on the portfolio tab read, Caldwell, B. Shortfall Resolution. My medical documentation, filed alongside financial records. Witness statements. A document I could just glimpse titled Settlement Terms, Draft 3. Vernon wasn't building a protective order. He was building leverage. Like the investment prospectuses I used to create layered evidence, corroborated sources, timeline visualization. Except I'd built portfolios to create value. Vernon built this one to destroy Bryce, and my 6 years of suffering had just become the cornerstone asset. In the parking lot, Vernon opened the car door for me like a gentleman. "What's the shortfall?" I asked. He smiled, thin and sharp. "Let's get you home first. Then we'll discuss what your husband owes me and what I plan to take in return. Vernon merged onto the highway, smooth and controlled. The question wasn't whether he'd been tracking Bryce's embezzlement, it was why he'd waited 6 months to tell me. What's the shortfall? I asked again. He adjusted the rear-view mirror. I'm not retired, Leora. I'm controlling shareholder of Meridian Logistics. Always have been. The information took a moment to settle. Bryce had worked at Meridian for 5 years. Every quarterly review, every performance evaluation, every salary negotiation, Vernon had access to all of it. Not through surveillance, through corporate authority. You've had access to Bryce's financials since he started there, I said. 5 years ago. The embezzlement started January 2024. Vernon's voice remained clinical. $127,000 in 6 months through vendor invoice fraud. Shell companies, fake invoices for logistics services never rendered. Payments routed to offshore gambling accounts. Gambling. The word landed with inevitability. The shortfall he mentioned in that call you overheard, that was the audit timeline closing in, I'd given him until July 1st to voluntarily disclose and arrange repayment. He chose escalation instead. You hired him, I said, in 2019, the same year as the business debt he tried to leverage. Vernon's silence was confirmation. You're thinking Vernon should have told me about the embezzlement in January, but I'm calculating backward. He hired Bryce at Meridian in 2019. The same year Bryce's failed venture created the debt that started the financial control. My father didn't just surveil my husband, he employed him. Every paycheck Bryce used to control me came from Vernon's company. And Vernon let it happen for 5 years before the embezzlement gave him legal leverage to act. Why didn't you fire him? Because firing him would have freed him from oversight. Employing him meant I could track every transaction, every relationship, every professional move. When the embezzlement started, I had the paper trail to destroy him. The logic was flawless and horrifying. Vernon had kept Bryce employed, kept him funding the life where he controlled me, so that when the moment came, Vernon would have ammunition. We pulled into the circular driveway of the Annapolis house where I'd grown up. Colonial revival, white columns, meticulously maintained gardens. My mother waited in the living room. Constance Thornton was early 60s, silver hair cut in a precise bob, wearing linen slacks and silk blouse that cost more than my monthly grocery budget used to be. She looked like every country club board member and museum patron she actually was, composed and elegant, until she saw me. Then her face crumpled. Leora. She stood, crossed the room, stopped just short of touching me. I'm so sorry. For what specifically? Constance flinched. Vernon closed the door behind us. Margaret Holloway mentioned her sister worked at the casino in Atlantic City. My mother said carefully. She'd seen Bryce there, high-stakes tables, 2017, before your engagement. The room tilted. Before the wedding. You knew before I married him. I didn't want to be your father, making your choices for you, controlling who you saw and what you did. Constance's voice broke. I thought I was respecting your independence, letting you make your own decisions, even your own mistakes. My mistake put me in the hospital, I said quietly, listening to my mother's tearful confession. I felt the specific grief of preventable suffering. If she'd spoken up in 2018, 6 years of methodical abuse might have been a canceled wedding instead of a medical file. The words, I thought I was respecting your independence, landed like the inverse of Bryce's control, same result, opposite excuse. She'd been so afraid of repeating Vernon's patterns that she'd chosen silence, and that silence had cost me 6 years. Vernon moved to stand beside Constance, not touching, the physical distance between them a perfect metaphor. I embedded Desmond in Bryce's professional sphere the month the embezzlement started, he said. That's intervention. I stayed silent about gambling rumors 6 years ago. Constance looked at me. That's abandonment. The pattern crystallized with painful clarity. Vernon controlled through omniscient surveillance. Constance enabled through strategic silence. Both chose their distance from each other's failures, and I fell through the gap between their complementary dysfunctions. You both chose your distance from each other's mistakes, I said. I needed you to choose me instead. My parents' dynamic was like the financial models I used to build. Vernon's surveillance was the aggressive growth algorithm, high control, high information, maximum leverage. Constance's silence was the conservative hedging strategy, low intervention, preserved relationship, minimal conflict. Neither model accounted for the variable that mattered, my actual safety, because they were optimizing against each other's failures instead of solving for my well-being. Vernon's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, answered. Desmond. I watched his expression shift to something that looked almost like satisfaction. Understood, Vernon said. Good. Now we can escalate to the legal outcome I've been preparing for. He ended the call and looked at me. Bryce filed a missing person report this morning. He's claiming you're mentally unstable and possibly endangered. He's hired Marcus Webb from Whitman and Associates. My mother gasped. I just felt cold. What does that mean? It means he's trying to control the narrative before the protective order filing. Vernon's smile was thin and surgical. And it means I can now deploy the criminal referral I've had ready since March. The medical evidence isn't just leverage anymore, it's defense. And his missing person report just gave me legal standing to move first. Move first with what? Everything, Vernon said. I learned later from phone records. Desmond subpoenaed that Bryce's first call to me came 43 minutes after I left the apartment. It wasn't to ask if I was safe. He returned home at 6:30 that Thursday evening, expecting dinner on the table. Instead, he found silence. My wedding ring on the kitchen counter, positioned exactly where my plate had been the night he'd beaten me for being 17 minutes late. My toiletries gone. The closet safe open and empty. The phone records showed he stood in the apartment 11 minutes before making that first call. Not 911, not my parents, my voicemail. Lyora, this isn't funny. You know how I feel about schedule disruptions. Call me back. Voicemail 3, an hour later. If you're trying to make a point, you've made it. Come home, and we'll discuss this like adults. By voicemail 7, the mask had slipped. If you think leaving makes you independent, remember whose name is on the lease, the bank account, your car title. You own nothing without me. The phone records showed he'd checked our joint bank account at 7:47 p.m. No activity. Attempted to track my phone location at 8:12 p.m. Disabled. Called my old office at 8:35 p.m. No answer. Every action calculated to recover control, not locate a missing wife he might fear was hurt. Bryce wasn't worried I'd been in an accident. He was running diagnostics on a system that had malfunctioned, trying to identify which variable had broken free. I'm telling you what Bryce experienced, because the phone records and voicemail transcripts became evidence. Desmond subpoenaed them for the protective order hearing. I never listened to all 23 messages. I didn't need to hear him weaponize my name that many times. But I needed you to see what Vernon saw. Bryce's panic wasn't about losing me. It was about losing control. The next morning at 9, a certified letter arrived. Meridian Logistics HR, Formal Internal Investigation Notice. This letter serves as notification of a formal internal investigation into financial irregularities within the Logistics Operations Division. The investigation covers vendor payment processing for January through July 24, with preliminary findings indicating approximately $127,000 in unauthorized transactions. Investigation authorized by controlling shareholder Vernon Thornton. You are placed on administrative leave effective immediately. The phone records showed Bryce read that letter for 6 minutes. Then he searched Vernon Thornton Annapolis on his laptop, found the private equity portfolio, the corporate board positions, the Annapolis estate. Then he searched his own email, V. Thornton 2022. The messages he'd sent trying to leverage Vernon's discretionary fund. The debt he'd threatened to expose. Vernon Thornton, Lyora's estranged father, the leverage target from 2022. The controlling shareholder who just launched an embezzlement investigation. The same person. Voicemail 12, 9:23 a.m. Lyora, I know you went to your father. This is about the business misunderstanding. We can fix this together. Just call me back and we'll work it out. Before I share what those final voicemails revealed, comment A, if you think Bryce still believed he could win her back, or B, if he knew it was over. Add one reason in 5 to 10 words. Quick note, the voicemail details are recreated from records for narrative impact. The pattern matters most. Over the next 6 hours, Bryce made 11 more calls, 23 total. Each message shifted through the predictable cycle. Commands, bargaining, threats, pleading, back to commands. Voicemail 18. I can explain the vendor payments. It's a cash flow timing issue, not embezzlement. Tell your father I'll settle everything. Just come home. Voicemail 20. You don't understand what you're doing. If this goes public, my career is over. Our life is over. You'll have nothing. Voicemail 23, 2:47 p.m. You don't understand what you've done. Vernon hired me in 2019 right after I contacted him about the debt. Right after. He's been setting this up for 5 years. You didn't leave me, Leora. You triggered a trap your father built before we even got married. Between the investigation letter and those escalating voicemails, I kept pausing the reconstruction. Desmond walked me through, kept hitting the specific grief of realizing even Bryce's 2019 job offer had been Vernon's chess move. The logistics position that gave Bryce income to isolate me, to make me quit my job, to control every dollar that paycheck came from my father's company. The economic abuse that trapped me was funded by the parent who eventually freed me. Bryce's 23 voicemails were like the financial models I used to build. Each message was a desperate recalculation trying to restore his control. But every variable he could manipulate, money, threats, pleading, legal ownership, had already been neutralized by Vernon's superior model running since 2019. Bryce was solving for dominance while Vernon had already solved for extraction. The phone records showed one final call at 3:47 p.m. Not to me, to a Maryland number registered to Whitman and Associates, where Marcus Webb practiced reputation defense and crisis management. The voicemail. Bryce left. This is Bryce Caldwell. I need immediate consultation regarding false allegations and coordinated family conspiracy. My wife's father has positioned himself to destroy my career, using fabricated evidence. I need someone who understands defamation law and can move quickly. Bryce wasn't fighting to get me back. He was preparing for the legal war Vernon had been building toward for 5 years, and the only weapon Bryce had left was the same legal system Vernon had already weaponized against him. The first text from Bryce arrived at 4:23 p.m., and I felt something I hadn't experienced in 6 years. Nothing. No spike of adrenaline. No stomach clench. No mental calculation of which response would minimize damage. Just cool assessment of watching evidence accumulate. 47 messages arrived over 3 hours. Text 4. You humiliated me. Filing missing person reports like I'm some criminal. Your father will regret this. Text 12. I'm not angry. I'm worried. You're not thinking clearly. Whatever your father told you is manipulated. Text 29. Baby, please. I know I scared you. I'll get help. I'll go to counseling, anger management, whatever you want. Just come home so we can talk face to face. Text 47. I'll fix this. The company thing, the marriage, everything. Give me 1 week. Please. I sat cross-legged on the hotel bed and screenshot every single message. Rage, pleading, bargain, promises, blame. The cycle compressed into 3 hours that used to take 3 weeks. I recognized the pattern from domestic violence research I'd read in secret years ago. Late nights on Bryce's laptop while he slept. At 7:15 p.m., I powered off the phone, not with shaking hands, with disgust. You're wondering if any of Bryce's messages made me waver. If the pleading ones tugged at 6 of conditioning. But I was reading them like I used to read financial disclosures, scanning for truth beneath presentation. Every I love you was surrounded by threats. Every I'll change came with blame. The pattern was so textbook I could track the abuser cycle stages in real time. The next morning, Vernon drove me to Raphael Kingsley's office in downtown Annapolis. The law firm occupied a renovated brownstone near the harbor, discreet brass plaque. Raphael Kingsley was late 40s, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that cost what Bryce used to earn in a month. A family law attorney specializing in domestic violence cases, though I didn't know yet that Vernon had hired him weeks ago. He met us in a conference room lined with legal texts, morning sun cutting through plantation shutters. He opened Dr. Kelsey's medical file first. The photographs of my bruises, yellow-green, purple-brown, deep red arranged chronologically by healing stage, the forensic narration. Nadine's witness documentation. Maryland classifies this as second-degree assault, Raphael said, clinical and kind. Felony charges carrying maximum 10 years. The multi-stage bruising pattern is prosecutable evidence even without victim testimony, though your cooperation strengthens the case significantly. He also forged my signature on resignation paperwork in 2022, I said. I saw it when HR processed my exit. The signature didn't match. Raphael made a note. Forgery adds fraud charges. That's economic coercion separate from the assault case, strengthens the domestic violence pattern documentation. Listening to him explain felony assault charges, I experienced the specific validation of professional legal terminology applied to my suffering. Second-degree assault. Multi-stage bruising pattern. Prosecutable evidence. The clinical language transformed what Bryce called arguments that got out of hand into crimes carrying maximum 10 years. Raphael pulled another file from his briefcase, slid it across the polished table. The tab read, Thornton v. Caldwell, filed 07/22/24. I stared at the date. 2 days before I'd packed my suitcase. 3 days before the medical exam. This filing date is 2 days before I left the apartment, I said quietly. Before the medical exam. Vernon's expression didn't change. I filed based on Nadine Foster's HR documentation and the preliminary evidence Desmond gathered. Your departure activated the plan, it didn't create it. Raphael opened the file, showing me the criminal complaint, the emergency protective order application, the divorce petition all drafted, reviewed, ready for execution before I knew I was leaving. We need your signature on the protective order affidavit and divorce petition, Raphael said. The criminal case proceeds with or without your participation, states evidence is sufficient. With or without. The words hung in the air. I'd thought I was choosing to leave. Choosing medical documentation. Choosing legal representation. But Vernon had filed the criminal complaint while I was still sleeping in the same bed as my abuser. The legal options Raphael presented weren't choices I was making. They were briefings on decisions Vernon had already executed. My role was ratification, not decision. Staring at the case file dated before my escape, I saw Vernon's legal strategy, like the investment portfolios I used to build. Front-loaded capital, diversified positions, timed execution. I was never the portfolio manager. I was the asset being repositioned, and the choices Raphael offered were just explaining the trades Vernon already executed. I reached for the pen, and Vernon's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, read Desmond's text, and smiled thin and sharp. Bryce's reputation attorney just withdrew, Vernon said. Saw the evidence file and told Bryce he's undefendable. Raphael nodded as if he'd expected this. Marcus Webb is smart enough to recognize a losing case. He won't attach his name to someone facing felony assault charges with this level of documentation. 48 hours. Vernon hadn't just built a legal case, he'd built one so airtight that even Bryce's hired defender abandoned him within 2 days of reviewing the evidence. The legal war Bryce thought he was preparing for was already over before his first voicemail. I signed the affidavit and divorce petition. My handwriting steady. Vernon had saved me. Vernon had also orchestrated every move of my rescue before I knew I needed saving, and I was only now understanding that being protected and being controlled could look exactly the same from the inside. Vernon's phone rang at 2:47 p.m. with news that Bryce had just tried to empty his personal checking account, and I watched my father smile the way predators do when prey walks into the trap exactly on schedule. We were in the kitchen, Afternoon sun through bay windows. Constance making tea with hands that still trembled when anyone mentioned Bryce's name. Vernon answered on the second ring. Desmond! He listened, that smile widening. How much did he attempt to withdraw? A pause. 43,000. His entire accessible balance. Vernon's tone was satisfaction wrapped in clinical observation. And the transfer requests? More murmured response. Personal accounts frozen per your standing authorization at Chesapeake Trust. Vernon repeated for my benefit. He has approximately $240 in wallet cash based on last ATM withdrawal yesterday. Vernon ended the call and set his phone on the marble counter with deliberate precision. He'll be here within 3 hours, he said. Desperation follows a predictable timeline. I stared at him. You froze his personal accounts. Not just our joint accounts, his personal money. I have institutional banking relationships that predate Bryce's employment at Meridian by 2 decades. Vernon poured himself coffee, unhurried. When I requested account holds pending fraud investigation, Chesapeake Trust was accommodating. Strategic, Vernon continued. He can't pay the reputation attorney who abandoned him. He can't fund relocation or defense. He has no financial access except what's in his wallet, and that won't last 3 days. You're thinking Vernon is protecting me, and maybe he is. But I'm watching him freeze assets, predict behavior, orchestrate confrontations with the same precision Bryce used to choreograph my days. The man who controlled my Tuesday grocery schedule lost to the man who controls banking institutions. I traded calculated dominance for corporate dominance, and I'm not sure that's freedom. Constance set a teacup in front of me, chamomile, the way she used to make it when I was sick as a child. You knew he'd try to access his money today, I said to Vernon. I knew Marcus Webb would withdraw yesterday afternoon. I knew Bryce would receive that notification last night. I knew he'd spend this morning researching alternative attorneys and discovering none will take him. I knew he'd attempt asset withdrawal by mid-afternoon. Vernon checked his watch. Patek Philippe, Platinum. And I know he'll arrive here between 5:15 and 5:45, trying to negotiate directly. How do you know that? Because it's what I would do, Vernon said. Remove professional intermediaries. Appeal to family connection. Fracture the opposing coalition before the legal process finalizes. At 5:23 p.m., Bryce's car, a leased Audi he could no longer afford, pulled into the circular driveway. I was upstairs in my old bedroom, watching through lace curtains. Constance had positioned herself beside me, protective barrier. Below, Bryce climbed out. His suit was wrinkled. He'd missed a shaving spot on his jaw. His body language cycled between aggressive shoulders back, chin up, and pleading hands open, posture conciliatory. Watching him approach, I felt a disorienting split. 6 years of conditioning still calculated his mood from posture, still prepared responses to minimize damage. But my rational mind noted Vernon's calm, Constance's protective positioning, the security of being here. Survival instincts don't update as fast as circumstances. My body screamed danger while the evidence showed safety. Vernon answered the door before Bryce could ring. Didn't invite him in, didn't raise his voice. Just stood in the doorway, tall and controlled. I need to see Leora. Bryce's voice carried upstairs. This is between me and my wife. You're interfering in our marriage. You're trespassing, Vernon said, conversational. The protective order hearing is scheduled for Friday. You can see her in court. You froze my accounts, my personal accounts. Bryce's volume rose. You can't, that's illegal coercion. Feel free to file a complaint. Vernon's tone didn't shift. Though I suspect you'll find accessing legal counsel difficult with $240 and no institutional credit. Bryce's hands clenched. For a moment, I thought he might swing. Then, Vernon's posture changed not aggressive, just colder. Something in his stillness made Bryce step back. Sit on the bench, Vernon said quietly. You're going to listen to the only terms you'll receive. I'm not taking orders from... Sit? Vernon's voice dropped to zero inflection. Or the criminal complaint I filed Monday includes the forgery charges Lyora just documented. 10 years maximum becomes 15. Bryce sat. I watched from above as my father, 64 years old, gray at the temples, wearing khakis and a polo shirt, like any country club retiree, reduced my 41-year-old abuser to a seated, silent audience. Vernon disappeared into his study, returned with a leather folder, and stood over Bryce on the porch bench. The power dynamic was theatrical. Vernon had engineered this exact confrontation, predicted Bryce's asset withdrawal, predicted his desperate arrival to within 6 minutes, and now controlled even Bryce's posture. "Now you'll listen," Vernon said. He opened the folder and began reading terms in the tone of a corporate merger negotiation. "You will plead guilty to second-degree assault. You will surrender all contested assets in the divorce. You will resign from Meridian Logistics effective immediately. In exchange," Vernon paused, letting Bryce's desperation build. And I realized the confrontation I was witnessing wasn't a father protecting his daughter. It was a controlling shareholder executing a hostile takeover of Bryce's entire existence, using my abuse documentation as leverage for terms Vernon had already decided. Vernon read the terms the way he probably presented hostile acquisition bids, no inflection, no emotion, just the mathematics of power transfer. Option 1. You plead guilty to misdemeanor assault. Maximum 1 year, likely suspended sentence with supervised probation. You forfeit all marital assets. You resign from Meridian Logistics with a neutral reference letter. You relocate outside Maryland within 60 days. Bryce's hands gripped the porch bench edge. "That's not a choice. That's total. In exchange," Vernon continued as if Bryce hadn't spoken. "The embezzlement becomes an internal personnel matter. No fraud charges filed. No felony record. You keep your professional reputation outside this jurisdiction." I watched from the upstairs window as the terms landed. Bryce's expression cycled through rage, calculation, disbelief. "You already negotiated the plea deal," Bryce said slowly. "This isn't an offer. This is theater." "I negotiated with the prosecutor's office 3 weeks ago," Vernon confirmed. "Conditional on your cooperation and my testimony that embezzlement findings support internal resolution rather than public prosecution." 3 weeks ago. While I was still living with Bryce, Vernon was negotiating plea agreements. "The alternative," Vernon said, tone dropping half a degree colder, "is option 2. He flipped to the next page. "I file every charge my legal team has documented. Embezzlement, 5 to 10 years. Felony assault, 10 to 15 years. Forgery, 3 years. Served consecutively, not concurrently." Bryce stood, paced 2 steps, sat back down. Trapped animal testing cage boundaries. It might sound like Vernon is being fair, offering Bryce a path that avoids total destruction. But listen to what he's actually offering. Plead guilty to hurting me. Lose everything. Leave Maryland. Live under probation supervision. The mercy is letting Bryce avoid fraud charges that would expose how long Vernon watched me get beaten while building his case. This isn't protection. It's damage control for both of them, and I'm the evidence they're negotiating over. "Your professional certifications will be revoked during incarceration," Vernon continued, clinical as Dr. Kelsey cataloging my bruises. "Every background check for employment, housing, credit will return. Convicted felon, domestic abuser, financial criminal. The embezzlement trial will be public record. Every prospective employer will find court transcripts detailing how you stole while forging your wife's resignation and beating her." "You're destroying my entire life over—" Bryce's voice cracked. "Over 6 years of documented domestic violence and 6 months of felony fraud." Vernon's correction was precise. "The destruction is proportional to the crimes. I'm simply offering you the choice between measured consequences and total accountability." Listening to Vernon catalog Option 2's destruction years in prison, professional annihilation, permanent criminal record, I felt disturbing satisfaction I didn't expect. 6 years of calculated abuse reduced to sentencing guidelines and felony classifications. The analyst part of my brain that Bryce tried to destroy resurfaces. This is what justice looks like when you have institutional power. It feels less like rescue and more like revenge, and I'm not certain I object. Bryce's composure fractured, then reformed into something harder. Desperate. I know about the 2019 coverage, he said, voice steady. Your discretionary fund paying off business debts. That's not standard trust activity. What would your regulators say about using family trusts to cover gambling-related losses? About targeting me for employment while holding financial leverage? For the first time, something flickered in Vernon's expression. Not concern. Amusement. He reached into the folder and pulled out a second document, slid it across the porch railing. SEC Form D filing, November 2019, Vernon said. Family hardship distribution, fully disclosed. Public record. You can read it online tonight. The trust distribution was reported to regulators the same month it occurred, categorized as family assistance during business insolvency. Completely legal, completely documented. Bryce stared at the form. The fight drained from his posture. You filed this 5 years ago, Bryce said quietly. Before you attempted to leverage it, yes. Vernon took the document back, returned it to the folder. I assumed at some point you'd discover the assistance and attempt to weaponize it. So I disclosed it proactively, consulted with counsel, and ensured every regulatory agency had full transparency. Watching Bryce's blackmail attempt dissolve against Vernon's pre-filed disclosure, I recognized the dynamic. Bryce played checkers tactical moves responding to immediate threats. Vernon played chess neutralizing potential threats years before they manifested. The 2019 SEC filing wasn't about regulatory compliance. It was about foreclosing future blackmail, and Vernon made that move before I even married Bryce. 48 hours, Vernon said. Sign the Option 1 agreement. Raphael will email tonight, or I file Option 2 Monday morning. This conversation is finished. Bryce stood, shaking. Not with fear, with the specific rage of total powerlessness ritualized publicly. Lyora knows what you are, he said, looking up at the window where I stood. She'll figure out this was never about saving her. He walked to his car, movements jerky, got in without looking back. The Audi disappeared down the driveway. Vernon remained on the porch, folder tucked under his arm, watching until the taillights vanished. Then he turned and walked inside as if he'd just finished a routine business call. And I realized Bryce was right. The 48-hour deadline wasn't mercy, it was theater. The Option 1 agreement Raphael would email was drafted weeks ago. Bryce's choice was performative, the outcome predetermined, and I was standing in my parents' home watching two men negotiate the terms of my freedom without anyone asking what I actually wanted. Bryce's hand was on the car door handle when he stopped, turned, and walked back toward the porch with the specific desperation of someone playing their last card. Vernon didn't move. Just watched Bryce approach with clinical observation. Zero surprise. The 2019 loss wasn't legitimate family hardship, Bryce said, voice steadier now. Your partner, Richard Kellerman, committed securities fraud. You covered it with trust funds to avoid SEC investigation into the entire portfolio. I watched from the upstairs window, Constance's hand on my shoulder. I have 3 years of archived filings, Bryce continued. If financial press gets documentation of fund irregularities, your investors will demand independent audit. That's your reputation destroyed, Vernon. 3 years. He'd been researching my father's corporate history for 3 years while controlling my grocery schedule, beating me for serving dinner late, isolating me from every friend. Vernon pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped twice, turned it to face Bryce. SEC Enforcement Release, 2019-147, Vernon said, voice unchanged. Our fund reported Kellerman's unauthorized trades in September 2019. Cooperated fully with investigation. Paid a $2.3 million penalty voluntarily. Wall Street Journal covered it November 7th. You can read the article. He scrolled, showing the text. Richard Kellerman's malfeasance was reported to SEC by our compliance department, resulted in his permanent barring from securities industry. Public record. Try again. He researched my father's corporate history for 3 years. 3 years of saving archived SEC filings while beating me for serving dinner late. The same man who forbade me from having a laptop researched securities fraud in his spare time. He wasn't just my abuser. I was his insurance policy, and he studied my family's vulnerabilities the way he studied my daily schedule looking for pressure points. Bryce stared at the phone screen. But the fund irregularities, the offshore accounts, were Kellerman's unauthorized positions, which we discovered during routine audit, reported immediately, and unwound at significant loss. Vernon pocketed his phone. I built my reputation by disclosing problems before they became scandals. You tried to build leverage by hiding crimes until they became felonies. There has to be something. Bryce's voice cracked. I spent 3 years. You spent 3 years looking for leverage while stealing from my company and using my daughter as your stress outlet. Vernon's tone dropped. I spent 5 years ensuring every vulnerability was already disclosed and resolved. We are not the same. Watching Vernon pull up the public filing the article, the penalty, the cooperation credit I experienced, the specific satisfaction of watching preparation defeat desperation. Bryce spent 3 years building leverage from records he thought were secret. Vernon spent 5 years making sure every scandal was already disclosed. Bryce's composure shattered. I didn't collapse dramatically. Just folded knees buckling, sitting heavily on the porch steps, face in his hands. The crying started quiet, then built to sobs that shook his shoulders. Not the manipulative performance I'd seen 100 times. This was different. Hollow. Atlantic City, he said through his hands. Started 2017. High-stakes poker. I won 18,000 the first weekend. Then I lost 40. Then I won 12. Then I lost 90. The number spilled out between sobs. 180,000 total. Atlantic City first, then online. I used the wedding money, the gifts from your parents, to cover the first debts. The loan sharks found me in December. They said they'd break my hands if I didn't pay by February. Loan sharks. The embezzlement starting in January suddenly made sense. The worst beating June 3rd. His voice broke completely. I'd lost 30,000 the night before on one poker hand. Online poker. 3 a.m. I watched the hand replay 12 times trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I came home the next day and you'd made dinner 17 minutes late and I needed... He looked up at the window where I stood, tears streaming. I used you. Every time I lost money, every time the debt got worse, I came home and found something you did wrong because I couldn't fix the gambling, but I could control you. I could make something predictable when everything else was chaos. Staring at Bryce, crying on the porch steps, I compared him to the financial models I used to build. When you strip away complex formulas and presentations, some portfolios are just over-leveraged positions covering losses with borrowed capital. Bryce looked like controlled power for 6 years, but underneath was just compounding debt and desperate gambles. He's crying like the man I thought I married. Real tears, real confession, the hollow center finally exposed. And I feel nothing, just cold relief that the monster had a pathetic core all along. The violence that destroyed 6 years of my life wasn't even about me. It was about a gambling addict using my body as an outlet for financial terror. Every beating was a symptom of his debts rather than my mistakes. Bryce looks up at me with the same pleading expression he used after every beating, the one that used to make me doubt my anger, that used to trigger forgiveness. But this time, looking at him broken on my parents' porch steps, confessing to gambling debts, and using me as a stress outlet, the cord of obligation that bound me for 6 years has been severed. The hollow man crying at my feet is just a stranger who happened to ruin my life for a while. Bryce wiped his eyes and shifted his body toward me. Not Vernon, me, and I knew what was coming before he spoke. The final manipulation, repackaged as surrender. Lyora, please. His voice cracked on my name. Not the assault charges, I'll sign anything for the divorce. You get everything. I leave Maryland, you never see me again. Just don't make me a convicted felon. I stood at the upstairs window, Constance's hand on my shoulder, watching him plead to the glass. I'll write a statement, Bryce continued, rushing the words. Public record, saying you were never at fault, that I take full blame for the marriage failing. You can have my admission of everything. You can have my admission, his permission. Even now, broken on my parents' porch, confessing to gambling addiction, he was framing himself as the grantor and me as the recipient. You know me, he said, and the familiar manipulation syntax made my spine straighten. You know I'm not. I made terrible mistakes, but you understand what I was going through. The gambling, the pressure, please, you understand. The same words after every beating, after the forged resignation, after isolating me from Nadine. You understand why I had to. You understand I was stressed. Vernon remained still on the porch, watching Bryce's performance with clinical detachment. I'm not asking Vernon, Bryce said, looking up at my window. I'm asking you. Wife to husband. The woman I loved to the man who failed her. I'm begging you for mercy. You're hearing generosity. I'm hearing control. He'll grant me innocence, bestow his admission, give me permission to be blameless, as if I needed him to authorize the truth. Even in surrender, he's framing himself as the grantor and me as the recipient. That's not accountability. That's rebranded dominance. Then Vernon did something unexpected. I took one step back from the porch railing. A single deliberate step creating physical distance between himself and Bryce's pleading. This is Lyora's decision, Vernon said quietly. Not mine, not yours. He looked up at the window where I stood, made eye contact, nodded once. For the first time in the entire extraction operation, the surveillance, the evidence gathering, the frozen accounts, the choreographed ultimatum, Vernon was ceding control. Constance appeared in the doorway behind Vernon. Whatever you decide, honey, she called up softly. We support you. When Vernon stepped back and said, This is Lyora's decision, I felt the vertigo of genuine choice after years of choreographed days. Vernon built the infrastructure, evidence, frozen accounts, legal options, but he's ceding the final decision. For 6 years, Bryce controlled my choices, and for 6 weeks, Vernon orchestrated my rescue. Now I have to decide something that matters without a script. I walked downstairs, each step deliberate, unhurried. Constance moved aside as I passed through the doorway, stepped onto the porch beside Vernon. Bryce looked up at me, hope flickering across his tear-streaked face. I looked down at him. The man who'd beaten me for serving dinner 17 minutes late. Who'd forged my resignation. Who'd used my body as an outlet for gambling debts and financial terror. I spoke clearly, every word deliberate. You're asking me to decide right now if you go to prison. After 6 years of controlling when I could speak, what I could say, how I should feel. Bryce opened his mouth. I held up one hand, and to my shock, he closed it. Here's what's different, I said. I get to decide what happens to you. Criminal charges or settlement, felony conviction or negotiated plea. But I also get to decide when I decide. Not on your timeline, not when your desperation demands an answer. Lyora, you controlled my schedule for 6 years. I continued, voice steady. You decided when I could eat, when I could sleep, when I could leave the apartment, when I could speak. You don't get to control when I decide your consequences. The evening air smelled like cut grass and salt water from the bay. Summer sounds, cicadas, distant traffic, wind chimes. You'll get my decision when I'm ready to give it, I said. That's what agency looks like, Bryce. My choice, not yours. Not anymore. Speaking my choice, not yours. I compared the moment to the financial models I used to authorize as an analyst. I'm not executing a predetermined calculation. Vernon built. I'm claiming authorization rights over my own outcome. Vernon supplied the data and risk assessment, but I'm the signatory on this decision. The power isn't in knowing the answer yet. It's in controlling when the answer gets executed. Bryce stared at me. I watched him calculate whether to push, whether to plead further, whether to demand immediate resolution. But something in my posture. The first time in 6 years I'd stood fully upright in his presence without defensive tension, without calculating his mood, without preparing responses to minimize damage, made him stay silent. He stood slowly, unsteady. Walked to his car without another word. The Audi's engine started, headlights cutting across the darkening lawn, taillights disappearing down the driveway. Vernon and Constance remained beside me on the porch, equally silent. I'd taken the power to decide Bryce's fate and refused to wield it on his timeline. Both Bryce and Vernon were now waiting on my terms. The next 48 hours belonged to me, and for the first time since I was 32 years old, my choices were entirely my own. I signed the criminal complaint on August 2nd, 3 days after claiming my right to decide, and the detective slid the witness oath across the desk, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd processed this exact document too many times. Detective Lauren Briggs was mid-40s, Baltimore PD Domestic Violence Unit, with tired eyes that had seen this story in 1,000 variations. She reviewed Dr. Kelsey's medical documentation while I sat in the interview room that smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Medical forensics dated and photographed, witness statements, financial documentation. Detective Briggs turned pages methodically. This is the most complete evidence file I've reviewed this year. She looked up from the file, made eye contact. Too many victims stay silent, afraid they won't be believed, or that leaving is more dangerous than staying, she said. You're doing the right thing. The validation landed different than I expected. Not relief. Acknowledgement that institutional recognition required this level of proof: the color-coded timeline, the forensic narration, the witness corroboration. When was the medical documentation filed here? I asked. Detective Briggs checked her computer. July 18th. Preliminary review flagged it for follow-up contact, which you're initiating now. July 18th. 2 weeks before my climactic declaration on the porch. That's 2 weeks before I claimed the right to decide on my timeline. Before I told Bryce I'd choose when I was ready. Vernon had already filed the medical evidence with police for review. My choice wasn't whether to build a case, it was whether to activate one already built. I'm learning the difference between having options and having agency, and they're not the same thing. I signed the witness oath, the complaint, the evidence authentication forms. 3 days later, August 5th, Meridian Logistics issued its press release. I read it on my laptop in the Annapolis kitchen while Constance made breakfast. Employee terminated following internal audit findings. Meridian Logistics announces immediate termination of a senior operations manager following discovery of financial irregularities during routine compliance review. Internal audit findings have been referred to federal authorities for investigation. The company maintains zero tolerance for fraud and is cooperating fully with law enforcement. Bryce wasn't named. Legal liability. But everyone who worked there would know. Vernon's phone rang. He answered, listened, ended the call. Press release issued at 9 a.m., he said. Termination effective immediately. Audit findings with FBI Financial Crimes Unit by noon. I pulled up Meridian's website. Searched the staff directory for Bryce's name. Already gone. His bio page returned 404, error. His email bounced. Security access revoked. Vernon didn't just fire him, he erased him from the corporate record in under 2 days. Reading the press release, clinical corporate language about terminated employee, and referred to federal authorities. I experienced the surreal detachment of seeing 6 years reduced to HR boilerplate. Bryce's professional identity erased in 2 paragraphs. It feels less like justice and more like efficient damage control. And I can't decide if that bothers me or if I'm just grateful someone finally treated my suffering as documentable fact. August 8th. Constance came home from book club shaking. A man called Margaret's phone during our meeting, she said, setting her purse down with trembling hands. Asked if I was Bryce Caldwell's mother-in-law. and whether the family was prepared to discuss his outstanding obligations. Vernon's expression went ice cold. "That's extortion," he said, already pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the FBI Financial Crimes Unit handling his embezzlement case. Gambling debt collection through family intimidation compounds his exposure." He walked into his study, door closing firmly. I looked at my mother. "He gave them your book club. He cataloged our entire social network as leverage for his debts." Constance sat heavily. "Margaret said the man knew where we meet, what time, that I attend every Thursday. He'd researched us. Not just me. Not just our marriage." Bryce had mapped the entire Thornton family names, social circles, routines, vulnerabilities, and handed that intelligence to gambling creditors as collateral. Vernon emerged 20 minutes later. "FBI is coordinating with local authorities," he said. "The call to Margaret's phone was recorded. She uses a service that archives everything for her real estate business. That recording is evidence of extortion attempt. Combined with Bryce's documented gambling debts, this strengthens the federal case significantly." "They won't contact us again?" Constance asked. "They won't," Vernon said with absolute certainty. After Vernon neutralized the loan shark threat within hours, I compared his protective network to the control systems Bryce used. Both cataloged my life, monitored movements, neutralized threats before they manifested. The difference is, Vernon's surveillance protects me from external danger, while Bryce's surveillance was the danger. But the infrastructure looks identical: monitoring, rapid response, total information awareness. That evening, Vernon handed me a tablet. "I want you to see something," he said. The screen showed a monitoring dashboard, my hotel room number with green status indicator, my car's GPS coordinates, my phone's location services feeding real-time data, notifications logging when I entered buildings, when I left, how long I stayed. "You're safe," Vernon said, as if the surveillance justified itself. "Everything's monitored. If there's any threat, I know immediately." I stared at the dashboard showing my life reduced to data points and location pings. The same total visibility Bryce demanded, rebranded as protection. And I realized the next phase of my recovery isn't escaping danger. It's learning to live without constant monitoring by any man, even one who loves me. The judge read the divorce settlement terms for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. And I spent the entire time watching Bryce's hands clench and unclench on the defendant's table as 6 years of control dissolved into enforceable court orders. Judge Catherine Morrison, Baltimore Circuit Court Family Division, spoke with clinical precision that transformed my suffering into legal findings. She'd reviewed Vernon's comprehensive evidence file, medical documentation, forged resignation, witness statements, timeline analysis. "The court finds overwhelming evidence of sustained economic abuse through forced career sabotage," Judge Morrison said. "Compensatory damages for lost earning potential, $340,000, calculated from financial analyst median salary versus administrative assistant earnings, T2 through 2024. $340,000. Bryce's attorney sat motionless, no substantive defense against documented evidence. "The forged resignation signature constitutes fraud that directly enabled the respondent's economic control," Judge Morrison continued. "The court awards punitive damages in addition to compensatory relief." She put a number on what he took from me. The analyst in me appreciated the precision. "Divorce granted. All marital assets awarded to petitioner. Permanent restraining order issued. This court is adjourned." The gavel struck. When Judge Morrison awarded that sum, the court calculated 6 years of financial analyst salary I would have earned versus administrative paperwork wages. It's the first time someone with institutional authority said, "What he did to your career wasn't love, it was theft." The number makes it real in a way all my private grief never could. 2 months later, January 14th, the criminal trial began. Nadine Foster took the witness stand wearing a gray suit, hands folded carefully. I saw the bruising pattern on her upper arm when her sleeve shifted at the copy machine. Nadine testified. 4 distinct marks, yellow-green healing stage. I recognized it because my sister survived the same careful placement, visible enough to control, hidden enough to deny. The jury leaned forward. "What did you do after observing these injuries?" the prosecutor asked. "I filed an HR incident report," Nadine said. "Documented the date, time, physical observations. I knew if she ever needed proof, I wanted it on record." Dr. Monica Kelsey testified next, walked the jury through forensic photographs. Yellow-green bruises, purple-brown contusions, deep red marks. The multi-stage healing timeline is medically inconsistent with a single incident, Dr. Kelsey explained. This documentation evidences repeated assaults over minimum 6-week period. The prosecutor presented Vernon's complete evidence file, medical records, photographs, timeline analysis, forged documents, financial records. "The defendant's own financial records corroborate motive," the prosecutor said. $180,000 in gambling losses, creating documented desperation that manifested as escalating violence. Watching Nadine testify about the June bruises, describing the careful placement she recognized from her sister's abuse, I experienced the strange validation of public witnessing. For 6 years only, Bryce and I knew the truth. Now, a courtroom full of strangers hears Nadine describe the yellow-green healing stage, the 4 fingertip marks, the copy machine moment. My private suffering has become public record. Bryce's defense attorney called character witnesses, colleagues who'd never seen him violent, neighbors who described him as polite. But character testimony couldn't counter medical evidence. The jury deliberated 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: felony assault, embezzlement, fraud. 1 week later, January 21st, Judge Harold Reeves, Baltimore Circuit Court, Criminal Division. Silver-haired and stern convened for sentencing. "The jury has found you guilty on all counts," Judge Reeves said, looking directly at Bryce. "Your actions constituted a sustained pattern of violence enabled by economic control and documented with medical precision." I'd submitted a written victim impact statement, but chose not to read it publicly. The judge held the pages now. "Ms. Thornton has provided a written statement for the record," Judge Reeves said. He adjusted his reading glasses. She writes, "For 6 years, I calculated survival in $20 increments while you calculated control in bruises hidden under long sleeves. The difference is, I'm still calculating, and you're done." Hearing the judge read my words I wrote but chose not to perform, felt like the financial reports I used to author as an analyst. I created the analysis, signed the findings, but didn't need to present it personally for the conclusions to carry authority. The court doesn't need my tears to validate my suffering. It needs my documented evidence and clear narrative. "For felony assault, 8 years, Judge Reeves continued. "For embezzlement, 5 years. For fraud, time served. Sentences to run consecutively. Total, 13 years. Remanded to custody immediately." Bailiffs moved toward Bryce. He stood, hands cuffed, and looked at me one last time. I looked back without flinching. I was led through the side door. Gone. I didn't read my statement in court. I wrote it, signed it, and let the judge's voice carry my words. I chose how my trauma got told, and that choice mattered more than performing it. Walking out of the courthouse after sentencing 13 years, consecutive terms, immediate custody, I felt the absence of catharsis I'd expected. Legal justice was complete. Divorce finalized, assets awarded, abuser imprisoned. But the courtroom victory didn't erase 6 years of hypervigilance, didn't restore the financial analyst career I lost, didn't undo the conditioning that still made me flinch at loud voices. I'd won every legal battle Vernon orchestrated, and I was realizing the next phase wasn't about courts or evidence. It was about rebuilding a self that existed before Bryce, before Vernon's rescue, before I learned to measure freedom in surveillance dashboards and protective orders. 6 months after I stood on this same porch and told Bryce I'd decide his fate on my timeline, Vernon asked me to sit in the same spot so he could explain why he'd hidden the truth about owning Meridian Logistics for 9 years. February 2025. The porch was cold, the bay visible through bare trees. Vernon brought coffee decaf, the way I took it now that hypervigilance made caffeine unbearable. "You asked me until I was 16. Right after your analyst certification, Vernon said. Don't use connections. Don't open doors I didn't earn. You wanted independent success, not nepotism. I remembered. 24 years old, fresh certification, determined to build a career on my own merit. When you married Bryce in 2018 and he worked at Meridian, I stayed silent. Vernon continued, honoring your request. I didn't realize that silence would let him embed himself in infrastructure I controlled. The irony landed heavy. You respected my autonomy until it nearly killed me, then violated it completely to save me. I don't know if that's tragic or just human. I've asked myself the same question for 6 months, Vernon said. When does protection become control? When does respecting independence become negligence? I don't have clean answers. Neither did I. Maybe you think he should have told me anyway that safety trumps independence. Maybe you're right. But I remember 2016, 24 years old, telling him I needed to succeed without his name opening doors. I meant it. The tragedy isn't that he respected my wishes. It's that respecting them created the infrastructure for someone else to trap me. Good intentions, catastrophic timing. We sat in silence, drinking coffee while the sun set over the Chesapeake. I don't know what comes next, I said. Legal justice is done. Bryce is in prison, but I don't know who I am without the hypervigilance, without the daily calculations. You're 38 years old, Vernon said quietly. You have time to figure it out. A month later, March 2025, I received an email from Simone Prescott. Simone Prescott was early 40s, a senior financial analyst who'd been my colleague before the forced resignation. Her email was brief. Coffee? Would love to catch up. We met at a Baltimore coffee shop on a Thursday morning. The place smelled like espresso and pastries. Simone looked exactly as I remembered, sharp blazer, reading glasses on a chain, warm smile. We missed your work, she said after we'd ordered. Still reference your 2021 municipal bond analysis model. Nobody's built anything cleaner since you left. The compliment caught me off guard. For 6 years, I'd been Bryce's wife, then abuse survivor, then plaintiff in criminal case. Simone was talking about my 2021 municipal bond analysis, my precision, my analytical skill, the identity that existed before Bryce. I've been gone since 2022, I said carefully. Over 2 years. Public trial, documented abuse case. That doesn't concern HR? Simone's expression softened. Your file's been in voluntary leave status. You can return anytime. I stared at her. Voluntary leave? Since November 2022, Simone confirmed. Your file shows voluntary leave effective November 2022. Seniority preserved, salary tier maintained. Someone in executive admin flagged it for retention priority. Vernon. His attorney arranged this while I was living with Bryce, thinking my career was destroyed. He protected my professional path without telling me, the same way he protected everything else. When Simone said, the team missed your work, without mentioning the trial or divorce, I felt the specific relief of being seen as a professional rather than a victim. Simone's talking about my analytical skill, the work I loved before everything collapsed. There are 3 senior analyst positions opening in Q2, Simone continued. Your old salary tier, plus inflation adjustments. The team would love to have you back. I can return to my old position? I asked. Same tier, same benefits, same team, Simone said. Or use the standing to negotiate senior positions elsewhere. You have options. Options. The word felt foreign. I'd grieved the loss of my analyst career for 3 years. The forged resignation. The destroyed professional identity. I'd believed it was permanently gone, that rebuilding meant starting from zero. But Vernon had quietly maintained my career path in administrative suspension. Same salary tier. Same seniority. While I suffered, he preserved the future I thought was destroyed. Learning my employee file was in voluntary leave status, while I believed my career was destroyed. I compared it to the evidence files Vernon assembled. He documented everything, protected every asset, preserved every option without telling me. I grieved the loss while Vernon quietly maintained it. Comprehensive protection paired with information control. I'm grateful and unsettled in equal measure. Thank you, I told Simone, for reaching out. I need to think about it. Take your time, she said. The positions don't post until April. Walking away from the coffee shop, I pulled out my phone to call Vernon and thank him for protecting my career file. But I hesitated. Accepting the preserved position meant stepping back into the professional life Vernon maintained while I suffered. Returning to a path he protected without my knowledge or consent. The offer represented everything I thought I'd lost, perfectly preserved and waiting. And I wasn't certain whether taking it meant reclaiming my former self or accepting that Vernon's version of my future was the only one available. The first time I walked Ocean City Beach alone without calculating exit routes or checking over my shoulder, I made it 17 steps before the hypervigilance pulled me back to the parking lot. But that was April, and this is May, and I'm learning that freedom is a practice, not a verdict. May 2025. I took a solo weekend trip to Ocean City, Maryland. No family, no surveillance dashboard, no check-ins. Just me and the Atlantic, gray-blue under overcast sky, the smell of salt and seaweed heavy in the humid air. I walked for 2 hours. 2 hours on this beach. No phone calls, no location tracking, no calculating whether the men behind me were threats or just tourists with metal detectors and beach chairs. Just salt air and the specific exhaustion of voluntary solitude. This was my 4th attempt. 3 times in April I'd tried solo travel, packed bags, booked hotels, drove halfway to destinations before the hypervigilance became unbearable, and I turned back. Each time, the nervous system that spent 6 years learning solitude equals danger overrode every rational thought about safety. But this time, I made it. 2 hours. Small victory, massive milestone. At 4:23 p.m., I took a photo of ocean waves and sent it to Vernon. No caption, no explanation, just the image. He replied 3 minutes later. Beautiful, 1 word. No questions about safety, no demands for hotel address, no surveillance dashboard alerts. Just acknowledgement. We're learning each other's boundaries, slowly. 4 attempts to walk a beach alone might sound excessive if you've never lived it. Bryce is in prison. Vernon respects boundaries now. The threats are neutralized, so what's left to fear? But hypervigilance doesn't update on court schedules. My nervous system spent 6 years learning that solitude equals danger, and unlearning that takes more than a guilty verdict. Freedom isn't granted by judges. It's practiced in 17-step increments until you make it 2 hours. June 25. I walked into a Baltimore pawn shop on Eastern Avenue. The clerk was mid-50s, bored expression, barely looked up when I described the watch. Women's Cartier, silver band, diamond markers, pawned June 2020. He disappeared into the back room, returned with a small velvet box. Pawned June 2020, never claimed, he said. $450 gets it out. You the original owner? Wedding gift, I said. My ex-husband pawned it without telling me. I'm buying back what was always mine. I handed him cash from the divorce settlement. $450 of Bryce's court-ordered payment to reclaim a watch Vernon originally gave me for $3,200. The watch was scratched, crystal clouded, band tarnished. The battery had died years ago, hands frozen at 3:17. Holding the reclaimed watch, scratched crystal. Dead battery. $450 of Bryce's settlement money exchanged for Vernon's original gift. I felt the specific satisfaction of economic reversal. Bryce pawned it for gambling stakes in 2020 when he was tightening financial control. I'm buying it back with money the court ordered him to pay for that exact control. The watch became currency twice, once for his addiction, once for my reclamation. I carried it to my new apartment, my apartment. First independent lease in my name since 2018. One bedroom in Bolton Hill, hardwood floors, bay windows overlooking the street. No surveillance cameras, no shared access, no one tracking when I come and go. I place the watch on the bedroom windowsill. Not my wrist, the windowsill. Displayed as art, not worn as function. The afternoon light caught the crystal, illuminated the frozen hands. 3:17. The exact time Bryce pawned it in June 2020. The clerk's timestamp preserved in mechanism failure. The battery died 5 years ago. I'm not replacing it. It sits here as reminder of what I reclaimed, not measurement of time I'm obligated to account for. I spent 6 years controlled by Bryce's schedules and 11 months protected by Vernon's timing, always measuring life by someone else's clock. The broken watch keeps no time because I don't need it to. My days are measured in healing milestones, now first solo beach walk, first independent lease, first morning I woke without hypervigilance calculating threat levels before my feet hit the floor. Vernon's extraction phone call lasted 15 minutes. That's all it took to activate the rescue he'd prepared for months. Justice didn't require dramatic confrontation or years of legal battle, just someone who knew exactly when to act and the resources to make it irreversible. The legal battles that followed were Vernon's orchestration, not mine. I signed documents, testified when required, made the single choice that mattered, whether to press charges or accept settlement. Everything else, the evidence gathering, the frozen accounts, the corporate termination, the FBI referrals, Vernon executed with precision I'm still processing. I'm grateful. I'm also learning that gratitude and autonomy can coexist without one negating the other. The watch on the windowsill catches afternoon light, its frozen hands reading 3:17 forever. Some moments stay frozen while you move past them. The marriage that ended, the control that shattered, the rescue that saved and surveilled in equal measure. I didn't call Simone back about the analyst position. Not yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I'll find something entirely new. The preserved career path Vernon maintained sits there like the watch evidence of what was protected, not mandate for what must be. I spent 6 years calculating survival in $20 increments and dinner timing. Now I calculate in healing milestones. First solo trip that didn't trigger panic attacks. First lease signed without cosigner. First week I went 3 consecutive days without checking over my shoulder. The watch keeps no time, and neither do I. Not anymore. Time moves differently when you're the one choosing what moments count. When hypervigilance becomes a practice skill, you consciously release, rather than a constant state you endure. The hands stay still at 3:17. I keep moving. That's the difference. Looking back, I wish I'd listened to the quiet warnings the first time he criticized my work. The first dinner where he timed my arrival. The first bruise I explained away. I thought love meant sacrifice. I didn't understand that healthy love never demands you shrink yourself to fit someone else's control. Don't make my mistake of waiting until rock bottom to reach out. Speak up sooner than I did. This isn't a revenge story about payback. It's about strategic protection and accepting imperfect rescue. Vernon saved me, but his methods were as controlling as they were comprehensive. I learned that healing means setting boundaries, even with those who protected you. I believe God showed me that survival doesn't require perfection, just persistence. Real freedom isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your voice, your choices, your timeline. Whether it's a beach walk after 4 failed attempts, or placing a broken watch on your windowsill, healing happens in the small, deliberate acts of choosing yourself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a situation where help came with strings attached? Share this with someone who needs to know they're not alone. And if you appreciate stories like mine, please subscribe to this channel for more real, raw reflections on family, survival, and second chances. Thank you for staying until the very end. As a final note, some details were fictionalized to protect privacy and enhance the narrative, but the core message about control, rescue, and reclaiming autonomy remains authentic. May you find courage in your own 17 steps.